The sinkhole opened 3 days after the last snow melted, swallowing a corner of the old chapel yard like a hungry mouth. Arya found it on her way home from school, drawn by the yellow caution tape and the cluster of neighbours peering into the dark. The ground had fallen away in a neat circle, exposing not dirt but something pale and facetted, something that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in fragments. She returned at dawn with her geology pouch and Theo, who brought a cardboard sun model he'd stayed up half the night building. The groundskeeper, Dom, hadn't arrived yet. They ducked under the tape. "Halite," Arya said, touching the exposed edge. "Salt. Not loose crystals, but solid rock, carved smooth." Steps descended into shadow. Theo aimed his flashlight down. "That's not natural." "No, it's not." They went slowly, counting steps. 23 down, then the passage opened into a chamber so vast the flashlight beam couldn't find the far wall. The air tasted mineral and old. Arya's breath came out in a cloud despite the calendar saying spring. The walls glittered, not with ice, but with salt formations that caught and multiplied their light until the chamber seemed to breathe with pale fire. Columns rose from the floor like frozen waterfalls. Someone, long ago, had carved them into something deliberate, something cathedral-like. Ribs vaulted overhead. Alcoves held nothing but shadow. "Look up," Theo whispered. High above, a shaft pierced the ceiling, perfectly round, perfectly vertical. Morning light slanted through it at an angle, painting a bright oval on the western wall. As Arya watched, the oval crept downward, degree by degree. "A sun tube," she said, "like at Newgrange. Except that's for solstice dawn." Theo unfolded his cardboard model, adjusting the brass bolt that served as earth. I think this hits the floor at local noon." They waited. The morning stretched. Dom's voice echoed from above. He was checking the perimeter, talking to someone about permits and liability. Arya and Theo kept still, backs pressed to a salt column. At 12:47 by Theo's watch, the light shifted. The oval narrowed, concentrated, became a shaft so solid it seemed you could lean against it. It struck the centre of the chamber, illuminating a floor slab of dark halite smooth as glass. And on that slab, faintly visible now that light touched it, were marks, deliberate scratches, a pattern. Arya crouched beside it. The marks formed a figure 8 lying on its side, stretched between 2 points. Ticks divided it like a ruler. Dates, she realised. Old-style dates, chiselled shallow. The upper loop was labelled in Latin she half remembered from her mum's old books. Estus, summer. The lower loop, Hemes, winter. "An analemma," Theo breathed. "The path of the sun at noon across the year." The beam held for 3 minutes, then began to slide east. The figure 8 faded back into shadow. Arya already had her chalk out. She didn't trace the hole. Thing, not that first time, just a small arc in the upper loop, bright white against dark salt. Theo calculated backward from his watch, and the equation of time, April 14th should sit right. There. She placed a clear quartz crystal from her pouch on the tick mark. Nothing happened. They sat in the dark for 20 minutes. Dom's footsteps crossed overhead. A raven called. Arya was about to pack up when Theo checked his watch and swore softly. "We used clock noon. It's 13 minutes off true solar noon here. The beam's already." The sun tube flared. Not the slow creep of morning, but a sudden column of light, thick and unwavering. It struck the crystal. The quartz blazed, and where the chalk lines glowed against the salt, the brine seams in the floor, hairline cracks Arya hadn't noticed, began to shine with a liquid blue-white light, as if something beneath the stone was waking up. The air bent. The chamber wall rippled like water, and through it Arya saw not stone but sunlight, wooden scaffolding, voices speaking a language that wasn't quite English, wasn't quite anything she knew. Theo grabbed her wrist. "Don't." But she'd already stepped through. The chamber was the same but different, younger, the salt columns less weathered, the alcoves still bearing carved symbols that would erode away before her time. The sun tube admitted a shaft of light slightly thicker than she remembered. No debris yet, no centuries of accumulation. And on the floor the analemma was freshly cut, the ticks crisp as yesterday. Theo stumbled through behind her, eyes wide. The doorway hung in the air behind them, a shimmer of refracted light humming softly. April 14th, Arya said. But when? A man in wool breeches and a linen shirt appeared from one of the alcoves carrying a bucket. He stopped, stared at them, crossed himself, and ran. They left quickly. Arya scrawled a note on the back of a receipt. We were here, April 15th, 2024, A&T, and weighted it with a pebble in a corner alcove. Then she knelt by the brine fountain she'd noticed earlier, a carved lion's head that trickled a constant stream of saturated salt water into a shallow basin. The water felt warm and slippery. She dipped her chalk-stained fingers in it, then splashed the floor, washing over the bright lines. The chalk dissolved fast, milky clouds spreading through the brine. When the last trace lifted from the stone, the doorway flared again. They stepped back through into their own April afternoon, hearts hammering, and climbed the stairs into ordinary daylight. Dom was locking the chapel door. He didn't see them slip away. That evening, Arya opened her dresser drawer to find her house key lying where she always kept it. Except it wasn't metal anymore. It was salt. Perfect. Crystalline. Detailed down to the grooves and the small heart-shaped bow. She picked it up and it crumbled slightly in her hand, leaving a grit of sodium chloride on her palm. The real key was gone. She called Theo. He came over with his notebook and a ruler, and they sat on her bedroom floor while rain tapped against the window. A cost, he said quietly. You didn't mention a cost. I didn't know. One trip, one object. Maybe. Arya placed the salt key on her desk, brushed the powder from her hands. It looked ghostly under her lamp. Or maybe it scales. Time spent, size of item. We were only there 15 minutes. Or maybe, Theo said, we shouldn't go back. But Arya was already sketching the analemma in her notebook, labelling the ticks, calculating. Her mother had died 2 years ago that October. If the dial could open any day, precisely placed. She didn't say it aloud. Theo watched her draw and said nothing. They went back 3 days later with better calculations and a plan. Arya chalked a date in 1918, November 11th, the miners' strike Dom had mentioned once. They stepped through into a chamber loud with men's voices, saw figures in caps and coveralls arguing by lantern light, and retreated after 60 seconds. Back home, Arya found her compass needle crystallised on her desk, the brass case still intact but the magnetised steel gone to salt. The next jump, 1793, the consecration ceremony. Robed figures, Latin hymns, the smell of incense and tallow. They stayed 4 minutes. Her phone case turned to salt that night, delicate and hollow, and when she tried to charge her phone the next morning, the metal charging port had transformed into a fragile lattice of halite crystals. Theo built a better gnomon from a dowel and a protractor, plotted the equation of time for every date on the analemma. Arya practiced with different chalks, thick, thin, pressed hard or soft. She learned that sloppy lines left residue the brine couldn't quite reach, and twice she saw what she came to call ghost doors. Faint, overlapping doorways where footsteps preceded bodies by seconds, where voices echoed out of sync, fractures in the neat flow of time. With each trip her collection grew, a photo of her mother, crystallised in its frame, the E-string peg from her violin, a tube of lip balm, a ballpoint pen, Theo's metronome Wait, which she'd borrowed and forgotten to return. He found it on his piano the morning after their 6th jump, a small salt cylinder that chimed softly when he touched it. This has to stop, he said, after one more. Arya was measuring the analemma with string and a protractor. If I complete both loops, summer and winter, the full figure 8, and erase them in one continuous session, I think it settles the debt, closes the circle, there's an old surveying principle, closing the traverse. This isn't surveying. It's geometry, and if there's a pattern, there's a rule. She tapped her notebook. The equinox is a nodal point, spring or autumn where the loops cross. If I do it then, under a clean beam with no interruptions, you'll what? Get your phone back. Your mum's photo. Arya's hands stilled. Maybe. Theo didn't argue. Further. But he started calculating the autumn equinox date, double-checking against 3 different sources, compensating for the cathedral's latitude and the slight drift of true north over centuries. The jumps grew longer. Arya went to 1640 when the chamber was new and stayed 20 minutes exploring the alcoves. She found fresh chisel marks, initials carved in Latin, and a woman in a grey habit sketching the analemma with charcoal. The woman looked up and smiled. You've come far to see this. Yes. Aria's Spanish was poor, but the woman seemed to understand. I am Magdalena. I tend the dial. She gestured at the floor, the sun tube, the careful measurements. It preserves what must not be lost. A day, perfectly kept. Do you understand? I think so. Good. Magdalena's eyes were kind and sharp at once. Then you know the price, but also the gift. Everything precious, saved in salt. Never rot, never fade. She reached out and gently took the crystal from Aria's hand, turning it over. Flawed, she murmured. The cleavage is imperfect. Let me fetch you a better one. She disappeared into an alcove. Aria waited, aware of the noon beam creeping across the floor, aware that she'd stayed too long. When Magdalena returned, she handed Aria a crystal that looked identical but felt different, heavier, or perhaps cooler. Aria thanked her and ran for the doorway, splashing brine over the chalk with shaking hands. Back home, she found her mother's locket on her dresser. The chain was still gold, but the hinged case had transformed into salt, and inside the tiny photograph was now a translucent mineral wafer. When Aria tried to open it, the whole thing crumbled. She sat on her bed and wept for the first time since the funeral. Theo found her there an hour later. He sat beside her in silence, then picked up one of the salt fragments. You have to stop. I know. Do you? The equinox. Aria wiped her eyes. One more time. I finish the pattern. And if it doesn't work, she didn't answer. The next 2 weeks were preparation and paranoia. A spring storm rolled through, and Aria watched the sun tube daily, terrified the beam wouldn't break through on the critical day. Dom announced the chamber would be sealed after the insurance inspection, structural concerns, liability, the usual bureaucratic litany. He'd already started moving equipment into the chapel basement. Aria's jumps became erratic. She tried to visit 1634, the year the dial was first carved, but the flawed crystal Magdalena had given her drifted the target by a day. She arrived in an empty chamber and heard voices one wall over, impossible to reach. When she returned, Theo's spare metronome weight and 2 of her own pencils had crystallized. The crystal's wrong, she told him, and Magdalena switched it. Why? Because she wants me to keep going. She said the dial preserves things, turns them into salt, into relics that never change. Aria paced her room, stepping over salt replicas, scattered like a strange museum. She wants everything I love salted and safe. That's not preservation, that's... I know. They made a plan. It required clearing the sun tube, recovering Aria's original crystal from Magdalena in 1634, and completing the full analemma in a single session on the autumn equinox, September 22nd by the old calendar, adjusted for drift, erasing it continuously at perfect local solar noon to settle the debt once and for all. The morning of the equinox came clear and cold. Aria and Theo met at the chapel before dawn, carrying rope, a pulley Theo had borrowed from his uncle, and Aria's entire geology kit. The sun tube had accumulated debris over the winter, a bird's nest, blown leaves, a century of dust. They rigged a pulley at the rim of the sinkhole and took turns lowering a bucket on a rope, clearing the shaft inch by inch while Dom's truck sat idle in the distant parking lot. By 10 a.m. the tube was clear. Theo set up his gnomon, a precisely levelled dowel on a marked board, and began tracking the shadow. Local solar noon would arrive at 12:03 p.m. They had one chance. At 11:45, Aria chalked the first loop of the analemma. Her hands were steady now, each line smooth and deliberate. The summer loop, Estus, curving through May and June and July. She placed Magdalena's flawed crystal aside and chalked onward, connecting to the winter loop, Hiems, descending through November and December and January. The figure 8 gleamed against the dark salt. 10 minutes, Theo said. Aria put down the chalk and picked up her last unsalted keepsake, a small magnifying lens her mother had used for field work, its brass rim worn smooth by years of handling. She held it for a moment, then set it in her pouch. I'm going back for the crystal. Aria, 5 minutes, I'll be fast. She placed the flawed crystal on the 1634 mark. The brine seams began to glow. The doorway shivered open, and Aria stepped through into a chamber lit by candles, and the noon beam slanting through a pristine sun tube. Magdalena was waiting, hands folded, smiling. "You've returned. I wondered if you would. You took my crystal. I gave you a better one. You gave me one that drifts. It doesn't land true." Arya kept her voice level. "I need mine back." "Why? This dial is a treasure, a way to preserve everything precious. Your mother's face saved forever in salt. Your friend's music crystallized into relics. You should be grateful." "I didn't want relics. I wanted to remember." Magdalena's smile thinned. "Memory fades, salt endures." "Memory lives." Arya stepped forward. "Give me the crystal." "I think not." The nun moved to block the alcove where she'd retrieved the false crystal weeks ago. Arya didn't hesitate. She darted left, ducked under Magdalena's reaching hand, and grabbed the small wooden box on the alcove shelf. Inside, nested in wool, was her crystal, the original, with its slight inclusion shaped like a leaf. Magdalena lunged. Arya threw the magnifying lens at her feet and ran for the doorway. Behind her, the nun's voice rose sharp and cold. "You'll lose everything. Better to save it, to keep it safe in salt." Arya splashed through the doorway and rolled onto the chamber floor in her own time. Theo was kneeling by the gnomon, eyes locked on the shrinking shadow. 3 minutes, he said. Arya placed her true crystal on the equinox node, the exact centre where the analemma's 2 loops crossed. The brine seams ignited, brighter than before, a lattice of light spreading through the floor. "Now," Theo said. She grabbed the bucket of brine they'd drawn from the fountain and began to pour. The water spread in a thin sheet across the analemma, dissolving the chalk from both loops at once. Arya worked in a spiral, inward and outward, keeping the wash continuous, no breaks, no missed lines. The figure 8 began to blur, summer and winter melting together. Behind her, the doorway flared. Magdalena's face appeared in it, furious, reaching through with one hand to smear the wet chalk, trying to force a permanent mark, a ghost door that would never close. Theo swept his arm through the pooling brine, pushing it toward the nun's hand. The salt water splashed across her fingers and she recoiled with a hiss, pulling back into 1634. The doorway wavered. "Faster," Theo said. Arya dumped the last of the bucket. The chalk lines ran together, dissolving into milky spirals. She dropped to her knees and scrubbed with her bare hands, feeling the salt abrade her skin, the brine stinging in a dozen small cuts. The last trace of chalk lifted from the stone like mist. The gnomon's shadow touched its equinox mark. Perfect solar noon. The chamber filled with light. Not white, but prismatic. Every colour the sun contained refracted through the crystal and thrown across the salt walls. The ghost doors Arya had left from sloppy erasures snapped shut with soft pops. The brine fountain surged, its trickle becoming a gout of water that flooded across the floor, drawing the last microscopic particles of chalk into solution. The crystal on the equinox node pulsed once, twice. The light peaked, painful and beautiful, and then the doorway, the real one, the complete one, the loop properly closed, flashed open and collapsed inward, sealing itself with a sound like a bell struck underwater. Silence. The noon beam faded to its ordinary slant. The chamber was just a chamber again, salt and shadow and the smell of brine. Arya and Theo lay on the floor gasping. Above them the sun tube admitted a soft column of afternoon light that meant nothing at all. That night, Arya returned to her room to find her salt collection unchanged. The key, the compass needle, the phone port, the locket, all still salt. But on her dresser, next to the crystallized remains, her actual house key lay shining and metal. Her compass sat in its case, needle trembling toward north. Her phone, when she picked it up, showed a crack in the screen but charged without trouble. Not everything returned. The locket stayed salt. So did the photo in its frame. Her mother's face now a permanent mineral ghost. The E-string peg from her violin. 2 pencils. A lip balm. The price of meddling, Arya thought. A reminder. She kept the salt key on her shelf next to the locket fragments. They caught the morning light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. Dom agreed, after some persuasion and a promise from Theo's uncle, who taught geology at the university, to keep the chamber accessible for research. They installed a gate at the sinkhole's rim, locked but not sealed. Theo posted their solar noon calculations and historical notes to the local archive. A graduate student wrote a paper on medieval timekeeping and sun tubes. Nobody mentioned doorways. Arya returned once, a week after the equinox, to check the analemma. The floor was clean, the chisel mark still visible but faint. She brought her chalk but didn't draw. Instead, she sat in the chamber at noon and watched the beam strike the empty stone, the pattern waiting, patient and silent. In her notebook that evening, she sketched a tiny analemma on the inside cover. She drew the summer loop, labelled the ticks, then stopped halfway through the winter curve, unfinished. A promise or a warning, she wasn't sure which. She could return. The dial would still work. The dates were all there, chiselled and patient. But now she knew what it cost to travel, what it meant to salt the past into relics that could never change. Her mother's locket sat on the shelf, a fragile white ghost. Arya picked it up carefully and held it to the window. The afternoon light passed through it like glass, and for a moment she could almost see the photograph inside, preserved not in metal but in memory, in the ache of knowing it had been real. She set it down, closed her notebook, capped the chalk. The analemma could wait, the circle could stay open. Some things, she thought, were meant to be finished, and some things were meant to remain just out of reach, a door drawn but not opened, a pattern traced but not travelled, the last line left unwritten so the story could continue. Outside, the sun dropped toward the hills. In the cathedral beneath the chapel, the brine fountain trickled in steady time, dissolving nothing, preserving nothing, simply marking the hours as they passed. One noon, then another, each one arriving exactly when it was meant to, each one gone before you could trap it in salt or hold it in your hands. The analemma could wait, the circle could stay open. Some things, she thought, were meant to be finished, and some things were meant to remain just out of reach. A door drawn but not opened, a pattern traced but not travelled, the last line left unwritten so the story could continue. Outside, the sun dropped toward the hills. In the cathedral beneath the chapel, the brine fountain trickled in steady time, dissolving nothing, preserving nothing, simply marking the hours as they passed. One noon, then another, each one arriving exactly when it was meant to, each one gone before you could trap it in salt or hold it in your hands. Yet Arya found herself returning, not to travel, but to watch. She came on Tuesdays after school, when Dom was checking the northern fence line and the chapel stood empty. She would descend the 23 steps and sit in the dark, waiting for the beam. Theo joined her sometimes, bringing his gnomon updates and orbital calculations, but mostly he let her sit alone. The chamber had become a different place now that she knew its cost. The salt columns no longer seemed merely beautiful, but weighted, each facet a moment caught and held, each crystal a choice made and unmade. She wondered how many others had found the dial, how many had chalked the analemma and paid the price. The ghost doors she'd sealed, had they been hers alone, or remnants of travellers from centuries past, their imperfect erasures leaving fractures she'd finally closed? One Tuesday in October, she found something new. A piece of paper, old and brittle, tucked into the alcove where she'd left that first note. She lifted it carefully. The handwriting was cramped. The ink faded to brown, but legible. To the girl who travels, beware preservation. What is saved in salt cannot grow. What is kept cannot become. Sinjarem has forgotten this. The dial was meant to teach us time, not trap it. When you finish the pattern, leave one tick unmarked. This is the keeper's final wisdom. Brother Andres, 1702. Arya read it 3 times, then folded it and placed it in her notebook. One tick unmarked. She thought of her half-drawn analemma, the winter loop left incomplete. Perhaps Brother Andres had understood something Magdalena never could, that completion meant ending, and some doors were healthier left ajar. At home that evening she found her father in the kitchen, cooking the pasta dish her mother used to make. He'd gotten the spices wrong, too much oregano, not enough basil, but he was trying. Arya watched him stir the pot, his shoulders slightly hunched, and thought about the salt locket on her shelf. She could go back to the day her mother died. October 17th, 2 years passed. She could chalk that date precisely, place the crystal, step through and see her one more time. But she would return to find what? Another object salted. Her father's watch, maybe. His wedding ring. The last photograph of them together. And her mother would still die, still be gone, still be nothing but a memory Arya carried forward alone. She set the table instead. They ate in quiet, and the pasta tasted wrong but warm, and that was enough. The graduate student, a woman named Clara who wore her hair in 2 long braids and smelled like library dust, visited the cathedral in November. Theo had mentioned the sun tube in his archive notes, careful not to include anything about doorways or time. Clara measured everything: the tube's diameter, its angle relative to true north, the precision of the chisel marks on the analemma floor. "Extraordinary," she said, kneeling beside the figure 8. "This is 13th century work at least, possibly earlier. The monks here must have been accomplished astronomers. Do you know if there are any records of who maintained it?" Arya thought of Magdalena, of Brother Andres, of the countless caretakers who had chalked and erased and chalked again. "I think it changed hands a lot. Pity. This kind of solar calendar is rare. Most were destroyed during the Reformation, seen as pagan or heretical." Clara ran her finger along one of the ticks. The analemma itself wasn't formally described until the 1600s, but clearly someone here understood the sun's declination and the equation of time centuries earlier. "What's it for?" Theo asked, playing ignorant. "Originally? Agricultural timing, probably. Planting dates, harvest schedules. Later it might have been used for determining liturgical dates, Easter calculations, that sort of thing." She stood, dusting salt from her knees. "But there's something odd. See how some ticks are deeper than others? And this residue in the seams." Arya's throat tightened. "Residue? Calcium carbonate, mostly. Chalk. Someone's been drawing on this recently. Within the last year, I'd say." Clara smiled. "Don't worry, I'm not the site police, but whoever's doing it should use a softer medium. Chalk can scratch the halite over time." When Clara left, Arya and Theo sat in the chamber's dimness. The noon beam had come and gone. Above them, winter clouds turned the sun tube grey. "She's right," Arya said quietly. "Every time I chalk it, I'm wearing it down. Another 100 years of travellers and the marks will be illegible. The dial will stop working. Maybe that's the point." Theo adjusted his glasses. "Maybe it's supposed to have a lifespan. Things aren't meant to last forever. My mum used to say that, about fossils." Arya drew her knees to her chest. "She'd find these perfect specimens, imprints millions of years old, and she'd say they were temporary. Everything's temporary. Even rocks. Even salt cathedrals. Even salt cathedrals." They sat in silence. Somewhere above, a raven called, and the sound echoed down the sun tube like a voice from another world. December brought snow and short days. The noon beam arrived at a steep angle now, striking the winter loop of the analemma, the Hiem section that marked the sun's low arc. Arya came less often. School demanded attention, finals, college applications, the ordinary machinery of moving forward. But the salt objects on her shelf remained, a small museum of what she'd traded for knowledge. On the winter solstice, Theo called her. "You should come to the cathedral now." She found him there at 11:30, setting up his gnomon in the cold chamber. His breath made clouds. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. But look." He pointed at the floor. The noon beam, when it came, would strike the lowest point of the winter loop, the solstice mark, the deepest tick. They waited. At 11:58, the beam descended through the sun tube, narrower than in summer, sharp as a blade. It touched the crystal Theo had placed on the solstice mark, and the brine seams flickered just for a moment. Not the full ignition Arya remembered, but a pulse, a heartbeat. "It knows," Theo said. "The dial knows when it's at a turning point. Solstice, equinox, the nodes of the year." Arya knelt beside the crystal. She could feel it, the potential humming in the floor, the doorway almost forming, one piece of chalk, one clean line connecting to the mark, and she could step into December 21st, of any year the dial remembered. She didn't draw. Instead, she picked up the crystal and held it to the light. Through its facets, the chamber multiplied into 1,000 versions of itself, each one slightly different, each one possible. "I'm not going to use it anymore," she said. "Not to travel," Theo nodded. "Okay. But I don't want it sealed either. Dom wants to cap the sun tube, fill in the sinkhole. He's worried about liability, kids getting hurt. So what do you want?" Arya thought of Brother Andres's note, of the unmarked tick, of leaving the pattern unfinished so it could remain alive, not trapped in salt but breathing with the years. "I want to teach it," she said. "How it works. Not the doorways, nobody needs to know about that, but the astronomy, the way the sun moves, the equation of time." They started small. Theo posted a notice at the library. Solar Observation Group, Tuesdays at the Old Chapel. 3 people came to the first meeting, a retired engineer, a homeschooled kid named Marcus, and a woman who'd grown up in the area and remembered the chapel before the sinkhole. Arya showed them the sun tube, the way the beam tracked across the floor. Theo explained the analemma, drew it on a whiteboard he'd carried down, labelled the loops and ticks. They didn't mention time travel or salt debts or ghost doors. They talked about declination and axial tilt and the way the Earth's elliptical orbit made solar noon drift from clock noon in a figure 8 pattern across the year. Marcus, 12 years old and sharp-eyed, asked if he could make a measurement. Arya gave him her notebook and a pencil. He timed the beam, noted its position, calculated the date based on which tick it struck. He was off by 3 days. The analemma had drifted slightly since it was carved, but his method was sound. By February they had 8 regular members. The retired engineer, whose name was Saul, brought a theodolite and started mapping the chamber's geometry. The homeschooled kid came every week with new questions. They measured, calculated, debated the cathedral's origins. Someone suggested it had been a medieval monastery's secret observatory. Someone else thought it was older, pre-Christian, a Roman surveyor's benchmark. Nobody guessed the truth, and Arya kept it that way. In March, Dom stopped by during one of their sessions. He watched them work, said nothing, then pulled Arya aside. "You're keeping people safe?" "Yes." "And you're not damaging the site?" "No, we're just observing," he grunted. "All right, but I'm putting up better railings at the sinkhole, and if anyone gets hurt, they won't." He left, but the railings went up the following week, along with a sign, "Historical Site, Exercise Caution." It wasn't quite official protection, but it was enough to keep the bureaucrats at bay. April arrived with rain, and the anniversary of Arya's first jump. She descended into the cathedral alone, carrying her chalk and crystal out of habit, but knowing she wouldn't use them. The noon beam struck the floor right where it had a year ago, illuminating the analemma's spring section. She thought about the objects that had returned and the ones that hadn't. Her house key had come back, solid and metal, now hanging on her keychain where it belonged. Her compass worked perfectly, its needle true, but her mother's locket remained salt, delicate and ghostly on her shelf. The photograph inside it was gone forever, or perhaps preserved in some other form. Not in crystal, but in the sharpness of her memory, the way she could still see her mother's face without needing the picture to remind her. The cost had been real. But so had the closing of the circle, the settling of the debt. She had travelled through time, yes, but more importantly she had learned to stop, to let the past be past, to let memory live instead of salting it into relics. Brother Andres had been right. What is saved in salt cannot grow. Arya took out her chalk and knelt beside the analemma. Carefully, precisely, she traced a single mark, not on the figure 8 itself, but beside it, in the margin. A small sigil, a circle with a vertical line through it, the astronomical symbol for Earth, a mark that said I was here, I learned. I chose to leave it unfinished. She rinsed it away at the brine fountain, watching the chalk dissolve into nothing, and climbed back into the afternoon light. That summer, the observation group planned a solstice event. They would track the noon beam on June 21st, the highest point of the analemma, and measure how much the sun tube's angle had shifted since medieval times. Theo built a new gnomon from brass and mahogany. Marcus designed a shadow plotting board. Saul brought a camera with a solar filter. The day came clear and bright. 20 people gathered in the cathedral, crowding the alcoves watching the beam descend. At 12:04 it struck the summer solstice mark, and the chamber filled with murmurs of appreciation. Cameras clicked. Someone took compass readings. Marcus charted the shadow and grinned when his calculations matched Theo's to within 2 minutes of arc. Arya stood at the back watching. None of them knew what the dial could really do. None of them had paid the salt price or seen Magdalena's smile or felt the brine fountain's warmth dissolving their mistakes. They saw only astronomy, beautiful and exact and utterly normal. And that was enough. More than enough. After the group dispersed, Arya stayed behind. The chamber had returned to shadow, the solstice moment past. She sat beside the analemma and thought about cycles, the Earth's long spin, the sun's patient track, the way every year returned to the same marks and yet nothing was ever quite the same. Her phone buzzed. A text from her father. Dinner at 6. Trying Mum's lasagna recipe. Wish me luck. She smiled and typed back, I'll bring garlic bread. As she climbed the stairs, she passed the alcove where she'd left her first note, the one addressed to herself from yesterday. The paper was long gone, dissolved by time or taken by some other traveller she'd never meet. But the act of leaving it had mattered. The act of marking time, of saying I was here, of moving forward. At the top of the stairs, Arya turned and looked back down into the dark. The sun tube admitted a slant of late afternoon light, thin and golden, striking nothing in particular, just salt and shadow and the patient ticking of water on stone. She could return tomorrow, next week, next year. The dial would be there, waiting, its pattern worn but legible, its doors ready to open for anyone who learned the rules and paid the price. But for now, she thought, for today, she would go home. She would eat imperfect lasagna with her father. She would finish her college essay about geological time and human memory. She would live in the present, in the moving moment that could never be trapped or salted or held. The past was behind her, preserved not in crystal, but in the person she'd become by travelling through it. And the future waited ahead, unmarked, unmeasured, a blank space on the analemma where anything might be written. She closed the gate and walked toward the parking lot where Theo was waiting in his car. Through the rear window she could see his cardboard sun model on the back seat, its brass earth bolt catching the light. He waved, she waved back. Above them, the sun tracked westward, moving through its daily arc, tracing its slow figure 8 across the months and years. The dial would mark it faithfully, one noon at a time, whether anyone watched or not. Some things, Arya had learned, were meant to be witnessed, and some things were meant simply to be, patient and permanent and utterly indifferent to human desire. She got in the car. Theo pulled onto the road. The chapel shrank behind them, and the shadows lengthened, and the day moved forward like all days, carrying them with it into whatever came next. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. The old dome stood at the summit like a fractured skull, its copper plating gone green and split along the seams where rain had worked its patience for decades. Maya climbed the last switchback as the sun dropped behind the ridge, her backpack heavy with camera gear and the battered lunar atlas that had belonged to her grandfather. 16 years old and precise in the way of people who photograph stars, she had come for the eclipse, for the clean geometry of shadow-crossing light, for a vantage no floodlit parking lot could offer. The observatory had been abandoned since before her parents were born. Built in the 1890s, when men still believed the heavens could be mapped by hand and eye, it had served one astronomer, Dr. Gideon Hare, whose name appeared in faded gilt on the dedication plaque beside the rusted door. Maya had read about him once in a Historical Society newsletter, a man obsessed with lunar topography who had vanished in 1922 without explanation, leaving only his instruments and a fire-scarred logbook filled with columns of numbers. She pushed through the door. Inside, the dome's interior curved overhead like the inside of a broken egg. Moonlight already slanted through the aperture slit, painting a silver stroke across the floor. The equatorial mount stood at the centre, its brass fittings clouded with verdigris, its telescope long since removed or stolen. But there, beneath a canvas tarp stiff with dust and bird droppings, Maya found something else entirely. A shallow pan, perhaps 3 feet across, set into a brass gimbal that allowed it to tilt and rotate with mechanical precision. The pan's interior was mirror bright, untouched by time, and when she pulled the tarp fully away she saw why. Mercury. A perfect pool of it, thick and luminous, holding the last daylight like molten silver. Around the gimbal's base someone had etched degree markings for altitude and azimuth. A brass alidade lay beside it, its sighting vanes still straight and true. Maya crouched beside the device, careful not to disturb it. Her grandfather had taught her the old ways of celestial navigation, the patient art of measuring angles against the horizon, of consulting tables to find where a celestial body should be at any given moment. This was a selenograph's tool, she realised, an instrument for mapping the moon. But why Mercury? Why a mirror instead of a lens? She opened the logbook she found on a nearby shelf, its leather cover cracked and fire-darkened along one edge. Dr. Hare's handwriting filled the pages, neat columns of dates, lunar phases, altitude and azimuth readings, all annotated with observations. But as she flipped deeper, the entries changed. The scientific precision remained, but the content shifted. Third traversal successful. Observed the Leonids as predicted. Sundial shadow lost upon return. And later, the det grows. Main Street flattens in noon sun. Must find the standstill alignment. And finally, scrawled in a shaking hand, I have become a keeper of what I stole. The dome's penumbra holds me now. Let no one follow this path without understanding the cost. Maya photographed the pages with her phone, then set up her eclipse equipment. But her mind stayed on the mercury pan, on the precise angles carved into its mount, on the logbook's warnings that sounded like madness but read like mathematics. When the moon rose, fat and orange over the eastern hills, she watched its reflection appear in the quicksilver pool, a second moon perfect and depthful, as though the mercury held not a reflection but a window. She should have been setting up her camera. Instead, she found herself consulting the logbook's tables, tracing the numbers against her own ephemeris data. November 15th, 2024. Lunar altitude 18 degrees, azimuth 102. She compared it to an entry from November 15th, 1899. The Leonid meteor shower, a storm of falling stars, altitude and azimuth carefully recorded. The phase matched, waxing gibbous, 78% illuminated. Maya's hands moved before her mind caught up. She adjusted the gimbal, tilting the pan to match the historical altitude, rotating it to the precise azimuth. The moon well, Dr. Hare had called it in his notes. A door, not a mirror, but doors needed keys. She found the vial in a velvet-lined case beneath the logbook, a tiny glass ampule containing a single bead of mercury no larger than a peppercorn. Instructions were etched into the case's lid. Upon the terminator, release the bead. Within the luminous disc, step. Warmth and today's alignment return you. Spill nothing. The moon's reflection in the pan sharpened as she made her final adjustments. It no longer looked like a reflection at all, but like a hole in the mercury's surface, a well of lunar light reaching down into impossible depth. The terminator, the line between the moon's lit and dark hemispheres, bisected the disc with surgical precision. Maya held the vial above it, her hand steady from years of long exposure photography, and tilted it just enough. The bead fell. It did not sink into the mercury but rolled along the terminator's edge, leaving a faint luminous trail, and stopped exactly at the disc's centre. The reflection deepened further, the moon swelling until it filled the pan's diameter, until Maya could see the shadows of its mountains and the bright rays of its craters with impossible clarity. Light poured upward from the pool, cold and white, painting the dome's interior in shades of silver and ink. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt the same pull she always felt when framing a perfect shot, the sense that something true waited just beyond the shutter's click. Maya placed one foot into the disc. The mercury held her weight like solid glass. She stepped fully in, and the dome fell away. The sensation was not of falling, but of inversion, as though she had stepped through a mirror into the same room, reversed. The dome reformed around her, but the air tasted different now, coal smoke and horse dung and something green and wet that modern air no longer carried. The equatorial mount gleamed with fresh brass and new paint. A telescope, massive and beautiful, pointed skyward through the aperture. And a man stood at a desk sketching lunar features with rapid, confident strokes. Dr. Gideon Hare looked up as Maya emerged from the moonwell's light. He was younger than his photograph suggested, perhaps 40, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that reflected the same silver sheen as the mercury. He did not seem surprised to see her. November 15th, he said, consulting a pocket watch. 1899, you aligned well. The Leonids will begin in approximately 40 minutes. I assume you've come to observe them. Maya's mouth worked soundlessly. The man continued sketching, adding shading to a crater's interior with delicate cross-hatching. Outside, through the dome's aperture, stars burned with a brilliance she'd never seen, unpolluted by electric light, fierce and numberless. I'm Maya, she managed. I found your logbook, the moonwell. Ah, Hare set down his pen. Then you know what it costs. Each traversal takes a shadow from the time you left. Small at first, easily missed. A sundial stripe, a fence post's darkness. But the debt compounds, I learned that too late. He gestured toward the window. Look at me in the moonlight. Maya looked. Dr. Hare cast no shadow. Even with the moon pouring light through the dome's opening, even standing directly in its silver flood, he produced no darkness at all. He was a figure of pure light, depthless, wrong. I travelled too often, he said quietly, mapping the moon's libration, chasing meteor showers, recording occultations. Each time I returned, something flattened. Shadows vanished. By the time I understood I had stolen too much, the town below lost its depth. Photographs went flat. Summer turned strange, neither cool nor warm, because shade no longer existed to contrast the light, and I became this. He spread his hands. A keeper of stolen shadows, bound to the penumbra I destroyed. The logbook said something about a standstill alignment, Maya said, a way to return what was taken. Hare's expression shifted, something like hope or hunger crossing his depthless face. The lunar standstill. When the moon reaches its maximum northern or southern declination, its altitude and azimuth at moonrise barely change across years, even decades. Align the moon well to that geometry, spanning multiple nights across time, and you create a channel. Shadows can flow back through it, restored to their proper moments. But it requires perfect precision and more traversals than I had strength left to attempt. Outside, a streak of light crossed the sky, then another, the Leonids beginning their celestial storm. Maya watched through the dome as meteors fell like burning rain, dozens per minute, bright, enough to cast fleeting shadows across the hilltop. Dr. Hare had returned to his sketching, capturing the shower's radiant point with quick, sure lines. She realized that from his perspective, she was the ghost, the impossible visitor from a future he would never see. How do I go back? She asked. Hare pointed to a spirit lamp on the desk. Warm the pan gently. The mercury will ripple and break the disc. Realign to your present ephemeris, skim the bead back into its vial across the ripples, and step through before the moon shifts. But be certain of your numbers. An error leaves you stranded. Maya pulled out her phone, shielding its glow. The ephemeris app showed the current moon, her moon, already 10 degrees higher than it had been when she jumped. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the alignment drifted too far. She lit the spirit lamp with matches from Hare's desk and held it beneath the moonwell's base. The mercury shivered. Tiny ripples spread from the centre, fracturing the moon's reflection into dancing fragments. Maya adjusted the gimbal with shaking hands, tilting and rotating until the angle matched her phone's data. The ripples smoothed slightly, and through them she saw not the November sky of 1899 but the familiar light-polluted haze of her own time. She found the bead still resting on the terminator, somehow present in both moments simultaneously, and used a clean glass rod from Hare's equipment to coax it back into the vial. The instant it left the mercury, the disc began to collapse. "Wait!" Hare called out. But Maya was already stepping through, the inverted sensation pulling her forward, and the dome reformed around her once more. Modern again, silent, empty. She checked her phone. 8 minutes had passed in her present. The moon hung exactly where her calculations predicted. Her camera equipment sat undisturbed. The eclipse still 40 minutes away. Everything was precisely as she had left it. Except when she looked out the dome's western window, toward the valley town below, the library's sundial cast no shadow. The moon illuminated it perfectly, a bright circle of stone, but the gnomon produced no darkness at all. The metal post stood there, solid and real, but it threw no shade, created no contrast, existed in a world gone somehow flat. Maya's hands went cold despite the mild November night. She had brought back a photograph of the Leonids, still displayed on her phone screen, shot in a time 125 years gone. She had spoken with a dead man and returned. She had proven that the moonwell worked exactly as the logbook described, and she had stolen a shadow from her own world without meaning to, without understanding, the way a child might pocket something bright without grasping what theft means. She should have left then, should have locked the dome and never returned. But Maya was 16 and precise, and had been raised on the idea that problems had solutions if you measured them, carefully enough. She spent the eclipse documenting the moonwell instead, photographing the mercury pan from every angle, copying the logbook's tables into her own notes, testing the gimbal's range and calibration. When dawn began to grey the eastern sky, She climbed down the hill with a pack full of data and a mind already working through the mathematics of correction. At school the next day, she found Ravi in the makerspace, bent over a breadboard and a tangle of wires. Ravi built instruments the way other people doodled, restless hands always measuring or calibrating or improving something. They had been friends since middle school, bonded by a shared inability to leave broken things broken. "I need an ephemeris calculator," Maya said without preamble, "one that can handle historical dates, parallax correction, atmospheric refraction, and libration, with an interface I can use in the field." Ravi looked up, pushing back safety goggles. "Good morning to you too. Why?" Maya hesitated. The truth sounded insane, but Ravi had never required normal. "I found something at the old observatory, a navigation instrument. I want to test its accuracy." "The place they're about to demolish?" Ravi pulled up a news article on his laptop. Ellery Development submitted their permit last week. They're turning the whole hilltop into luxury condos, groundbreaking in 3 months. Maya felt something tighten in her chest. 3 months to understand the moon well, to master its alignments, to find the standstill solution Dr. Hare had mentioned. 3 months before floodlights and construction crews made precise nighttime observations impossible. "Then I need the calculator soon. Can you build it?" Ravi grinned, the expression of someone handed an interesting problem. "I can have something working by Friday, but I want to see this instrument, and you're buying lunch for a week." Friday came, and Ravi followed Maya up the hill. The sunset painted the valley in shades of amber and rose. She had checked the sundial every day that week, documenting its shadowless state, watching as the anomaly spread. By Wednesday, the flagpole outside the post office had joined it, standing bright in afternoon sun but producing no darkness. By Thursday, 3 different streetlights near the library failed to cast pools of shadow beneath them, their light somehow dispersing without contrast. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they dismissed it as a trick of perception, the way eyes adjust and ignore. But Maya's eclipse photographs confirmed it. She had processed them carefully, measuring luminance values, and found that shadow regions in frames taken after her return showed diminished depth, flatter tonal curves, as though something had reached into the image and lifted out the darkness without disturbing anything else. Ravi's reaction to the moonwell was everything Maya had hoped for. He circled it 3 times, examined the gimbal's mechanism, traced the degree markings with one finger, and then sat down hard on the dusty floor and laughed. "This is either an elaborate art installation or the most beautiful navigation instrument I've ever seen. What does it navigate?" "Time," Maya said, and told him everything. The jump to 1899, Dr. Hare's shadowless form, the missing sundial shade. She showed him the logbook, the photographs, the flattened luminance curves. She expected skepticism. Instead, Ravi pulled out his phone and opened the ephemeris app he had built, its interface clean and precise, and began comparing the logbook's tables to calculated lunar positions. "The math checks out," he said after 10 minutes of silence. "Every entry I've tested matches the actual historical ephemeris within 2 arc minutes. That's impossible unless he was actually observing from those nights, or had access to calculation methods that didn't exist yet, or..." He trailed off, staring at the mercury pool. "You really stepped through." "I really did." "And it took the sundial's shadow when you came back?" "Yes." Ravi stood and walked to the moonwell, kneeling beside it the way Maya had, careful and reverent. "Show me how to align it. I need to understand the mechanism before I can help solve this." They spent the next 3 weeks running controlled tests, short jumps into the recent past, hours rather than years. Maya would align the moonwell to 3 nights ago, drop the bead, step through for exactly 5 minutes by her phone's timer, and return using Ravi's app to ensure precise realignment. Each test worked perfectly. Each test also extracted a cost. After a jump to Monday to observe a particularly clear moonrise, a section of the school's courtyard lost its shadow at noon. After a hop to the previous Friday, Ravi's own silhouette began to thin at the edges, its darkness turning grey and uncertain. They documented everything meticulously, photographing each new shadowless region, mapping the spread, searching for patterns. The stolen shadows seemed to follow lines of connection, relationships between the time they visited and the places or people they interacted with, however briefly. "It's like a debt," Ravi said, studying a spectrogram of his own thinning shadow. The Moonwell lets you borrow time, but time demands repayment. Every moment you spend in the past is a moment of contrast removed from the present. Light and shadow, past and future, it's all balanced. Maya thought of Dr. Hare, trapped in the dome's penumbra, a man who had borrowed too much and could never repay. He mentioned a standstill alignment, a way to restore what's taken, but I don't fully understand the geometry yet. They were still researching lunar standstills, still testing short hops and measuring their costs, when Ms. Ellery's construction crew arrived. The floodlights went up on a Tuesday, massive fixtures on portable towers, bright enough to turn midnight into noon. The developer herself came to supervise their placement, a severe woman in an immaculate suit who regarded the dome the way someone might look at a rotten tooth waiting for extraction. Heritage site, she said, when Maya tried to explain the observatory's historical value. I've seen the records. One astronomer, no notable discoveries, abandoned for a century. The land's worth more than the history. Those lights stay on for the survey work, and in 3 months, this whole hill gets graded. Find a different place to stargaze. The floodlights ruined everything. They washed out the faint lunar illumination needed for precise alignment, created glare that made reading the alidade impossible, and worst of all, they eliminated the darkness necessary for the Moonwell's reflected disk to appear depthful and clear. Maya and Ravi tried working in the brief windows when the construction crew shut down for the night, but the lights ran on automatic timers, blazing back to life at seemingly random intervals. We need to map the timer pattern, Ravi said, pulling out a notebook. Find the dark gaps and work within them. It's the only way we'll have enough time to attempt a standstill alignment. They spent 2 weeks documenting the floodlight schedule, discovering that the system cycled through 20-minute dark periods every 2 hours between midnight and 4 in the morning. Not long, but possibly enough if they were fast and precise. Maya used the time to study Dr. Hare's later logbook entries, the increasingly frantic notes about shadow debt and restoration. The standstill alignment appeared again and again, described in fragments. Maximum declination, one entry read. Northern standstill approaches. Must align across keystone nights. Fire, Leonids, threshold, in single sequence. Meridian line channels the return. Dawn timing critical, but strength fails. The dome holds me now. Maya traced the fire reference back through earlier pages and found it. March 7th, 1919. A blaze had destroyed part of the dome, consuming stored records and nearly killing Dr. Hare himself. He had barely escaped with the logbook and his lunar plates. After the fire, his entries became more erratic, less focused on pure observation and more on the mechanics of temporal travel. An idea formed, reckless and careful at once. If she could jump to March 6th, 1919, the night before the fire, she might prevent it entirely. Save the records, preserve the archives. It would be a large change, a significant intervention, but surely saving knowledge was worth the cost. She did not tell Ravi her plan. The next night, during a dark gap between floodlight cycles, she climbed to the dome alone. The ephemeris for March 6th, 1919 showed a waxing crescent moon, altitude 23 degrees, azimuth 95. She lined the Moonwell with hands that had learned its rhythms, dropped the bead, and stepped through before doubt could stop her. The dome materialized around her, younger by a century, lit by oil, lamps and the thin crescent moon. Dr. Hare sat at his desk, older now than when she'd seen him during the Leonids, his face lined with exhaustion, his shadowless form almost translucent in the lamplight. He looked up as she arrived and sighed, a sound carrying the weight of too much knowledge. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This is the night before the fire. I know because I've tried to prevent it myself 6 times. Each attempt extracted a greater cost and the fire always finds a way. The archives burn because I left a lamp too close to my papers while making an observation. Simple carelessness. No malice, no grand drama, just human error compounded by exhaustion." "Then I'll move the lamp," Maya said. "I'll stay awake with you, keep watch." "And what will you pay?" Hare's voice was gentle but firm. "This is not a small change. These archives, once saved, alter the entire thread of preservation and scholarship. You will owe a significant shadow debt, one that may claim more than you're willing to lose." Maya thought of the sundial, the flagpole, Ravi's thinning silhouette. Then she thought of the knowledge about to be lost. the careful observations and hand-drawn lunar maps. Show me where the lamp goes. I'll be careful. They worked through the night together, Maya keeping the oil lamp safely distant from the papers, while Hare completed his observations. When dawn began to grey the sky, he helped her realign the moonwell for her return, his movements practised and sorrowful. "The debt will come due," he said, as she skimmed the bead back into the vial. "Choose carefully what you're willing to pay." Maya stepped through and emerged into her own time. The dome looked different immediately, better preserved, less fire-scarred. She checked her phone and found new historical articles about the Hare collection, a significant archive of lunar observations and 19th century astronomical equipment, preserved by unknown means and later donated to the State University. Her intervention had worked. But when she descended the hill and walked into town as morning light strengthened, she saw what it had cost. Main Street, the central thoroughfare with its shops and cafes and centuries-old brick facades, cast no shadows at all. None. People walked without silhouettes. Cars moved in bright continuous light. Awnings produced no shade. The entire street existed in a world without depth, flat and strange and wrong. She stood at the corner, watching her own parents walk past the bakery, and saw that they threw no darkness either, their forms bright and depthless in the morning sun. Maya ran back up the hill, her breath harsh in her throat, and found Ravi waiting in the dome. He looked pale, translucent around the edges, as though his substance had thinned during the night. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "My shadow's almost gone. I woke up this morning and barely saw it, even in direct sunlight, and Main Street looks like a photograph somewhere, overexposed, all light and no contrast," she told him. The fire, the archives, her choice to intervene. Ravi listened without interrupting, then sat down heavily beside the moonwell. "We have to fix this. The standstill alignment. We need to figure it out before the debt spreads further, before there are no shadows left at all." They studied the logbook together, cross-referencing Dr. Hare's cryptic notes with lunar cycle data and the observatory's meridian line, a strip of polished marble set into the floor that marked true north-south. The standstill, they learned, occurred approximately every 18.6 years, when the moon's orbital inclination reached its maximum. During these periods, the moon's altitude at rise and set varied minimally across multiple years, creating a kind of temporal resonance. "If we align the moon well during a standstill," Ravi said, sketching the geometry, "and open doors to multiple keystone moments simultaneously, we create a channel. The meridian line acts as a conduit. Shadows that were extracted can flow back through it, restored to their proper times and places. But it requires perfect precision across several alignments in rapid sequence, and we'd need to do it all during a single dark gap before the floodlights cycle back on." "Can your app calculate the sequence?" Maya asked. "Already working on it. But Maya, there's a problem. The next northern standstill peaks in 8 days, and according to these notes, the alignment window is vanishingly small, maybe 90 seconds. If we mistime it, if the floodlights come on, if clouds roll in, we have to try." They prepared obsessively. Ravi built a portable spirit lamp with precise temperature control and modified the alidade to include electronic level readouts, accurate to 1/10 of a degree. Maya photographed every inch of the dome and memorized the meridian line's orientation. They mapped the floodlight timer down to the second and identified a 23-minute dark gap starting at 2:47 in the morning of the standstill date. It would have to be enough. Ms. Ellery's crew advanced their timeline. On the 5th day of preparation, a surveyor appeared at the dome with eviction paperwork and a firm deadline. 3 days, he said. "After that, this structure is coming down whether you're in it or not. Developer's orders, clear your things and stay off the property." Maya and Ravi ignored him. They had no intention of leaving before the standstill, and after that either the dome would matter in new ways or nothing would matter at all. On the night of the alignment, they arrived 2 hours early and began setting up. Ravi had programmed his app with a sequence that would guide Maya through 3 precise angles in 90 seconds. The March Fire Night, the November Leonids, and a third date Maya had discovered in the logbook's margins, June 21st, 1997, noted only as threshold family plate critical. "What's the 97 date about?" Ravi asked as they calibrated the gimbal. I don't know yet, but Hare marked it as critical, and it appears in his calculations for the standstill channel. We need all 3 doors opened simultaneously for the shadows to find their way back. At 2:47 precisely, the floodlights died. Darkness rushed in like water filling a hole, and overhead the moon hung at its maximum northern declination, as high as it would climb all year. Maya aligned the moonwell to the first angle, March 1919, and dropped the bead. The disc opened, depthful and luminous. She moved immediately to the second alignment, November 1899, and used a second bead from a cache she'd found in Dr. Hare's equipment. Another door opened, the 2 discs somehow occupying the same space, overlapping, creating a double exposed reflection of 2 moons, 2 nights. Ravi called out time warnings. 60 seconds to floodlights. You need the 3rd door. Maya's hands flew across the controls, adjusting altitude and azimuth for June 97. The app showed the angles, but something felt wrong, off by some factor she could not name. She compensated by instinct, by the feel of the gimbal under her hands, and dropped the 3rd bead. The disc shivered, and 3 moons appeared in the mercury, 3 nights layered like transparencies. Light poured up from the moonwell in a column that painted the dome's interior in impossible silver. Through the layered discs, Maya saw Dr. Hare standing at his desk in the March night, watching her with sorrowful pride. She saw the Leonids falling like rain in November 1899, and through the June door she saw herself, not her present self, but a child, perhaps 6 years old, standing in the dome with her grandfather. This was the threshold night, she realised. The night he'd brought her here for the first time, told her about stars and precision, and the patient work of measuring heavens. The memory had faded over years, but seeing it through the moonwell brought it back sharp and whole. Her grandfather had been photographing the summer moon, teaching her to frame shots, to wait for moments of perfect clarity. He had found something that night, she remembered now. Found the moonwell under its tarp and shown her the mercury, let her watch the moon's reflection without understanding what else the instrument could do. A photographic plate had fallen behind the moonwell's mount, one of Dr. Hare's original lunar maps. Her grandfather had retrieved it, excited by the discovery, meaning to bring it to a museum. But he had died that winter, and the plate, wherever it had ended up, was lost. 30 seconds, Ravi called. The meridian line began to glow, a strip of luminous marble running north-south across the dome floor. Maya watched as darkness flowed down it like liquid, like ink pouring from the moonwell's column of light. Shadows returned along its path, pooling at specific points, before spreading outward. The sundial's shades snapped back into being. The flagpole's darkness reformed. Main Street's depth returned, its buildings regaining contrast and weight. Ravi's silhouette solidified beside her, his substance restored. But the column of light began to pulse, and through it Maya heard Dr. Hare's voice, somehow carried across a century. Stay with me in this perfect night. No more debts, no more losses. The standstill holds all moments equally. You need never return to a world that changes and fades. Stay here in the light, where everything remains precisely as it was. The temptation was real, and cold, and bright. Maya had spent weeks paying for her mistakes, watching shadows vanish because she had been careless, reckless, too eager to fix things she barely understood. How much easier to step into the perfect preservation of the past, to exist in a moment calculated and controlled, where precision meant safety and nothing ever surprised or disappointed or died. 15 seconds, Ravi said, his voice tight with worry. Maya, the realignment. You need to come back now. She looked at the child in the June disk, the version of herself that did not yet know grief or loss, still held safe in her grandfather's patience and love. Then she looked at Ravi, solid and real and present, his shadow firm and dark on the floor, where moments ago it had been dissolving. She thought of her parents on Main Street, walking in proper sunlight with proper shadows, depth and contrast, and all the complicated beauty of a world that insisted on changing. Maya reached for the spirit lamp and lit it, holding the flame under the moonwell's base. The mercury shivered, ripples spreading from centre to edge. The 3 moons wavered and began to collapse. She adjusted the gimbal to her present ephemeris, the angles Ravi's app showed for this exact moment, 2:51 in the morning standstill peak. The discs compressed toward each other, the light column fracturing into bands. "Now," Ravi shouted, and Maya used the glass rod to skim all 3 beads back into their vial in a single sweeping motion. The beads rolled across the rippled mercury, tracing luminous paths, and with each pass a band of shadow snapped back down the meridian line, flowing out through the dome's open door, racing down the hill toward the town. She saw the library sundial catch its full darkness. She saw the streetlights bloom proper pools of shade. She saw Ravi's form settle fully into depth and weight. The floodlights blazed back to life, harsh and flat and modern. The moonwell went dark, just a pan of liquid metal now, reflecting only the dome's cracked ceiling. Maya collapsed beside it, exhausted and whole. Outside, dawn began to grey the eastern sky, and she knew with the certainty of good measurement that every shadow had returned to its proper place and time. The debt was paid. Dr. Hare's form appeared one last time, translucent in the corner of the dome, no longer trapped but simply visiting, the way ghosts visit places they loved and lost. He smiled, nodded once, and faded. Later, when Maya opened the logbook to record what they had done, she found a new entry in his handwriting despite the page being blank moments before. "Depth requires cost. Thank you for paying yours. The plate is in the West Archive box, 3rd from the mount. Use it well." They found the box where Hare's note indicated, and inside, carefully wrapped, her grandfather's lost photographic plate. A map of the moon's North Polar region, annotated in Dr. Hare's hand and her grandfather's both, 2 observers a century apart collaborating through the strange medium of careful measurement and found artifacts. Maya held it up to the dawn light and saw the shadows on the lunar mountains rendered in perfect depth and detail, every crater catching darkness, every peak throwing shade, light and contrast working together to reveal the truth of distant landscapes. 3 days later, when Ms. Ellery's crew arrived for demolition, they found representatives from the State Historical Society and a county heritage inspector waiting with an emergency preservation order. The Hare Collection archives, their value suddenly recognised, had triggered a review of the entire site. The dome would be stabilised, the instruments conserved, the logbook studied. The luxury condos would have to find another hilltop. Maya and Ravi stood outside the dome as the construction crew packed up their floodlights, the dark gaps in their schedule now permanent. Ravi nudged her shoulder. "So what do we do with a moonwell once we've saved it?" "Lock the beads away," Maya said. "Document everything for whoever comes after us, and maybe exhibit some photographs." She had been working on a series, images from the town taken before and after the shadow restoration, arranged to show the gradual return of depth and contrast. She planned to title it Penumbra, after the partial shadow, the region where light and darkness meet and mingle, where nothing is entirely one thing or another. That evening she climbed back to the dome alone, carrying the lunar atlas that had belonged to her grandfather. She sat beside the moonwell as the moon rose, its reflection appearing in the mercury without depth or invitation, now that no bead marked the terminator. Just a reflection, perfectly ordinary, perfectly beautiful. The observatory had taught her something about precision, about measuring carefully and accepting costs, about understanding that every intervention, every jump, every attempt to fix the past extracted payment from the present. But it had also taught her that some debts were worth paying, that shadows gave meaning to light, and that the richest detail in any photograph lived not in the bright highlights, but in the dark places where depth and mystery and truth gathered like water in a well. She opened the atlas to a page marked with her grandfather's handwriting, a note she had never noticed before. Precision is not about being right. It's about knowing how wrong you might be and measuring carefully anyway. Maya locked the vial of mercury beads in the archive box beside Dr. Hare's logbook, then walked down the hill. The stars began to appear overhead, numberless and burning, each one throwing its ancient light across distances too vast for easy measure. Behind her, the dome stood dark and whole against the sky, keeping its instruments and secrets for whoever might need them next, for whatever future moment demanded the kind of careful measurement that changes worlds. The town below had settled into its restored shadows, the sundial marking hours again, the streetlights casting proper pools of darkness, Main Street holding its depth and weight through the cooling autumn evenings. No one spoke about the weeks when shadows had thinned and vanished, the way no one speaks of dreams that fade upon waking. The flatness had passed like an illness, and people returned to their lives without quite remembering what had been lost, or why its return felt like breathing after holding your breath too long. But Maya remembered. She carried the knowledge the way Dr. Hare had carried it, written in measurements and warnings, preserved in careful documentation for those who might follow the same path. She understood now why he had filled the logbook with such precise detail, why every traversal had been noted with date and cost, why his final entries read like prayers and equations combined. He had been leaving breadcrumbs for whoever found the Moonwell next, trying to spare them the learning curve that had cost him his substance and his freedom. She thought of him often in the weeks that followed, the shadowless astronomer trapped in the dome's penumbra, neither fully present nor fully absent, bound to the place where he had stolen too much time. His final appearance during the standstill alignment had seemed different, though, lighter somehow, as though the restoration of shadows had freed him as well. Perhaps paying the debt worked both ways, releasing creditor and debtor alike from the weight of what was owed. Ravi finished his ephemeris app and released it as open-source software, though he buried the parallax and libration calculations so deep in the documentation that only someone specifically seeking time travel geometry would recognise their purpose. They never spoke directly about what the app could enable, but they both knew it was there, a tool waiting for the next person who found themselves standing before a mercury mirror, wondering about doors and keys and costs. The Historical Society's preservation of the dome moved quickly once bureaucracy recognised the value of Dr. Hare's archives. Workers stabilised the structure, replaced broken panes in the aperture, cleaned and catalogued the instruments. They found the Moonwell, of course, and debated its purpose. Some called it a selenographic mirror, used for tracking lunar features. Others suggested it was an early attempt at liquid mirror telescope technology. No one guessed its true function, and Maya did not enlighten them. Some knowledge needed to be discovered rather than given, earned through the patient work of alignment and measurement and costly mistakes. She did donate the photographic plate her grandfather had found, the one showing the moon's north polar region, with annotations from 2 different eras. The Historical Society displayed it alongside Dr. Hare's other lunar maps, noting the unusual collaborative nature of the observations, but unable to explain how a photograph from the 1890s contained marginalia in her grandfather's 21st century handwriting. Maya smiled at the placard's careful phrasing. Provenance uncertain. Further research required. Winter came to the valley, and with it the long nights that astronomers love. Maya returned to the dome regularly, sometimes with Ravi, sometimes alone, always with cameras and the lunar atlas and a growing portfolio of shadow work. She photographed the sundial at every hour, documenting how its gnomon shades swept across the stone face, marking time through the patient geometry of light and darkness. She captured the streetlights' pools of shadow, the way they overlapped and blended on snowy evenings. She framed shots of people walking through crosswalks, their silhouettes stretching long in morning light, compressed tight at noon, vanishing at dusk. The exhibition opened in March, on the anniversary of the fire that had almost destroyed the archives, though only Maya and Ravi understood the significance of the date. She called it Penumbra, Studies in Depth and Cost, and filled the gallery with paired images showing the same scenes before and after shadow restoration. Most viewers saw them as artistic studies in contrast and light. A few, those who had lived through the shadowless weeks without quite remembering them, stood before the photographs with expressions of recognition and unease, as though the images touched some half-forgotten dream. One elderly woman spent 20 minutes before a photograph of Main Street, studying the deep shadows cast by awnings and lampposts and walking figures. "It wasn't always like this," she said to Maya, who happened to be standing nearby. "Was it? I remember a time when everything looked flat, overexposed, like a photograph with the contrast turned down. But that doesn't make sense. Shadows don't just disappear." "No," Maya agreed carefully, "they don't. But sometimes we stop seeing them, stop noticing the way they give depth to things, make them real and solid. This series is about learning to see that depth again, about understanding what we'd lose if shadows were gone." The woman nodded slowly, still studying the image. "My husband died last winter. For weeks after, I couldn't see properly. The world looked flat to me, like someone had reached in and removed all the dimension, left only the bright surfaces. I thought it was grief doing that, changing my vision. But maybe it was something else. Maybe the world really did go flat for a while. Maya felt her throat tighten. She had not considered that the shadow debt might affect perception as well as reality, that people might feel the absence even if they could not name or remember it clearly. "I'm sorry about your husband," she said, "but I think the depth came back. I think things are solid again now." "Yes," the woman said. "Yes, they are. Thank you for these photographs. They help me remember that shadows matter, that they're not just absence but presence. The shape of darkness tells you as much as the shape of light." After she left, Ravi appeared at Maya's elbow. "That was heavy," he said quietly. "You okay?" "I'm fine, just thinking about costs." Maya gestured at the photographs lining the gallery walls. "We paid the shadow debt, restored what was taken, but people still felt it while it was gone, even if they couldn't articulate why the world seemed wrong. That's a kind of cost too, the psychological weight of living in a flattened world." Dr. Hare wrote about it in his later entries, how the town changed in subtle ways as shadows vanished. People became more isolated, less connected. Photographs stopped selling at the local shop because they looked wrong, too bright, too empty. Marriages fell apart because partners couldn't see the depth in each other anymore. "But we fixed it," Ravi said. "The standstill alignment worked. Everything came back. This time. But what if someone finds the moon well again? Someone who doesn't read the logbook carefully or doesn't understand the costs until it's too late? What if they think they can travel freely, fix everything they regret, save everyone they've lost, and only realise what they've done when their whole world has gone flat?" Ravi was quiet for a moment, looking at the photographs. "That's why you're exhibiting these, not just as art, but as warning. Documentation of what happens when shadows disappear, and celebration of what it means when they return, both at once." Maya pointed to her favourite image in the series, a shot of the observatory dome at sunset, its curved shadows stretching long across the hilltop, the meridian line visible through the open door as a strip of white marble bisecting the darker interior. Depth requires contrast. Light needs shadow. Time needs both past and present, held in balance. The Moonwell taught us that, but most people will never stand beside it, never drop a bead on the Terminator, never step through into another night. This exhibition is for them, the ones who'll never travel but still need to understand what time costs and why shadows matter. The show ran for 6 weeks and drew more attention than Maya had expected. A photography magazine interviewed her about the technical aspects of capturing shadow detail. An astronomy blog featured her work alongside a historical piece about Dr. Hare and the newly preserved observatory. The local newspaper ran a story connecting the exhibition to the heritage site designation that had saved the dome from demolition. Through it all, Maya spoke carefully about light and darkness, about preservation and cost, about the patient work of seeing truly, but she never mentioned Mercury or traversals or the weeks when the town's shadows had vanished like breath from glass. Only once did someone ask directly. A young man, maybe 20, studying computer science at the State University, stood before the paired images of Main Street and said, "These were taken weeks apart, but the sun angle is identical. Same time of day, same season. How did the shadows change so much between frames? It's like you photographed 2 different realities." Maya met his eyes and saw recognition there, the sharp attention of someone who had noticed something impossible and wanted to understand it. "Sometimes reality shifts," she said carefully. "Sometimes the world loses depth and has to be restored, piece by piece, shadow by shadow. If you're interested in how that works, there's a logbook in the observatory archives. It's publicly accessible now, part of the Hare collection. Look for the entries from 1919 onward. They're written in the language of astronomy, but if you read carefully, they're about something else entirely." The young man nodded slowly. "Time travel," he said, so quietly that no one else could hear. "That's what this is really about. The observatory, the instruments, the missing shadows. Someone found a way to move through time, and it cost them something, cost the whole town something." "If someone had found that," Maya said, matching his quiet tone, "and if they had learned what it cost, and if they had managed to restore what was taken, what would you say to them?" He thought about that for a long moment, studying the photographs with new understanding. "I'd say thank you for paying the debt, and I'd say be careful who else you tell. Not everyone should have access to that kind of power, even if they think they'd use it wisely, especially if they think they'd use it wisely. Good answer, Maya said. The logbook is there if you need it, but read all of it before you make any decisions. Understand the full cost before you consider paying it. Will do. He handed her a business card with his university email. If you ever want to talk about astronomical instruments and their unusual applications, let me know. I'm good with temporal mathematics and ethical frameworks. Might be useful if anyone needs to calculate, say, the long-term consequences of specific observational choices. Maya pocketed the card, recognizing an ally when she met one. The knowledge would spread this way, carefully and slowly, passing between people who understood precision and cost, who would approach the Moonwell with respect rather than casual curiosity. Dr. Hare's legacy, preserved not just in archives but in the careful transmission of understanding from one generation to the next. Spring arrived with longer days and shorter nights, the moon's phases cycling through their eternal rhythm, waxing and waning and waxing again. Maya graduated high school with a portfolio strong enough to earn scholarships, her Penumbra series opening doors to programs that valued technical skill and conceptual depth. Ravi received early admission to engineering school, his ephemeris app cited in the application as evidence of his ability to solve complex interdisciplinary problems. They climbed to the observatory one last time before leaving for college, carrying no cameras or instruments, just themselves and the knowledge they had earned through traversals and costs and the patient work of restoration. The dome stood stable now, its copper plating cleaned and repaired, its interior preserved as historical space. Tourists visited on weekends, guided by docents who explained the equatorial mount and the brass alidade and the curious mercury mirror whose purpose remained officially uncertain. But at night, when the site closed and the tourists departed, the dome returned to its essential silence, moon-washed and patient, waiting for whoever might next understand what it offered and what it demanded. Maya and Ravi sat beside the moonwell as sunset faded to dusk, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue. The mercury lay still and bright, reflecting the sky without depth or invitation, just liquid metal in a brass pan, nothing more. "Do you ever want to jump again?" Ravi asked. "Now that we know how to manage the costs, how to use the standstill alignment to restore what's taken, we could go anywhere, any night. See the Library of Alexandria before it burned. Watch Shakespeare's first performances. Stand on the beach at Kitty Hawk." Maya thought about that. The temptation of endless nights accessible through precise calculation and careful alignment. "I think about it," she admitted. "But I also think about Dr. Hare, how he started with pure observation and ended trapped in the consequences of his own curiosity. The Moonwell isn't evil or corrupt. It's just powerful, and power always costs something. Maybe the smart thing is to know it exists, to understand how it works, and to use it only when the cost is worth paying, not for curiosity or adventure, but for preservation, for saving things that truly matter. Like the archives from the fire. Like the archives, like knowledge that would otherwise be lost. But not casually, not often, and never without counting the cost first." She touched the vial in her pocket, the mercury beads locked safely away, keys to doors that should remain mostly closed. "We're the keepers now, the way Dr. Hare was. Our job isn't to travel, but to preserve the instrument and the knowledge, to make sure it's here when someone genuinely needs it, and to make sure they understand what they're taking on before they drop a bead and step through." Ravi nodded, looking up at the emerging stars. "The next standstill is in 18 years. If someone needs to restore shadows then, they'll have the logbook and your photographs and my app. They'll have everything we learned, all the mistakes we made and corrected. They won't be starting from nothing the way we did. That's all we can do," Maya said. "Pass on understanding, leave better instructions than we received, hope that whoever comes next is as careful as they are curious." The moon rose, fat and amber over the eastern hills, exactly as it had risen the first night Maya climbed to the dome with her camera and her grandfather's atlas, and no idea what she would find. How long ago that seemed now, though barely 9 months had passed. She had been looking for a clean place to photograph an eclipse, a simple shot of celestial mechanics, light and shadow in their eternal dance. Instead, she had found a door to every night that had ever been, a mirror that reflected not just the moon but time itself, and in using it, in paying its costs, had learned more about depth and measurement and the weight of choices than any textbook could teach. She thought of the woman at her exhibition, the one whose husband had died, who had felt the world go flat in her grief and confusion when the shadows vanished. That was the true cost of the shadow debt, not just the physical absence of darkness, but the emotional weight of living in a world suddenly bereft of depth and solidity. Dr. Hare had noted it in his later entries. Depression rates rising in town, divorce filings increasing, people reporting feelings of unreality and disconnection. When shadows disappeared, more than visual contrast vanished. The sense of substance itself eroded, leaving people adrift in a bright, flat world where nothing seemed quite real. And when the shadows returned during the standstill alignment, that weight had lifted. Not immediately, not for everyone, but gradually, like winter giving way to spring, the world had regained its solidity and depth. The woman's comment about things feeling solid again wasn't metaphorical but literal description. Shadows had come back, and with them, the felt sense of reality, the anchoring weight of darkness that made light meaningful. "We should go," Ravi said, as full dark settled over the hilltop. "The dome closes soon, and I don't want to get locked in. Though I suppose if we did, we'd know how to get out." He grinned, gesturing at the moonwell. Maya smiled back but shook her head. "No casual jumps, remember? We're keepers, not travellers. Besides, I like this time, this present. It's flawed and complicated and full of problems we can't solve by jumping backward. But it's ours, it's real, and it casts proper shadows." They left the dome as the moon climbed higher, its light painting the hillsides silver and black, every tree and stone throwing perfect darkness. Maya looked back once at the observatory, its dome silhouetted against the starfield, its shadow, pooling dark at its base, and felt a deep sense of rightness. The moonwell waited within, patient and powerful, ready for the next person who needed it badly enough to pay its costs. But for now, tonight, this moment, Maya had paid her debts and learned her lessons and earned the right to walk forward into the future rather than sideways through the past. Behind them, inside the dome, the mercury lay still as glass, reflecting nothing but the slow wheel of stars and the patient moon that had witnessed every human night since the first fires burned and cast their small defiant shadows against the darkness of the world. The moonwell remembered Dr. Hare and his obsessive mapping, remembered Maya and Ravi and their costly restoration, and would remember whoever came next, whenever they came, however they used the instrument that could open any night like a door if you measured carefully enough and understood what you were willing to pay. Depth requires contrast. Light needs shadow. Time demands both past and present held in careful balance, neither one consuming the other, both existing in their proper places, casting their proper shades. The moonwell taught that lesson to everyone who used it, carved the understanding into their bones through the weight of shadow debts paid and restored. And those who learned it well, who understood the true cost of traversal, became not travellers but keepers, guardians of the instrument and the knowledge, standing watch over a power that could reshape worlds for anyone who had the precision to align it and the wisdom to know when that precision was worth the price it would extract. Maya descended the hill with Ravi beside her, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight, solid and dark and real. The town below glittered with lights, and the spaces between lights, brightness and darkness working together to give the valley its depth and substance. Everything was as it should be, balanced and whole, each shadow in its proper place, each light casting its proper darkness. The debt was paid, the world was restored, and the moonwell waited, patient and precise. For the next night someone needed to open a door through time, and was prepared to pay the cost of stepping through. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The flood came in late spring, turning the valley into a temporary lake, and when the water drained, it left behind a sinkhole where the old quarry road had been. The blasting crew had tried to shore up the erosion, but their dynamite had done more than move earth. It had reopened something older, something that had been sealed when the first miners left these hills a century ago. Iris found it 3 days after the all clear, when the ground was still soft and the air smelled of wet stone and disturbed soil. She had her grandfather's dented carbide lamp in her pack, the one he'd left her with a field notebook full of diagrams she'd never quite understood. Theo was with her, because Theo was always with her when she went looking for caves. He had the rope and the good sense, and she had the curiosity that wouldn't let her sleep until she'd seen what the earth had opened. The entrance was narrow, a crack in limestone that widened after 10 feet of crawling. Then it opened into a chamber that made Iris stop and forget to breathe. Above them, 10,000 glowworms clung to the ceiling like a sky turned upside down, their tiny lights cold and blue-green, patient as stars. But it was the walls that held her. Opal! Not gem-quality stones, but veins of it, threading through the limestone in loops and curves that caught the lamplight and threw it back in flashes of colour. Numbers, Iris realised. Dates. Year. Month. Day. Arranged in segments that ran along the cave wall in a great circle, each set separated by nodes where the opal thickened into small pools of frozen fire. "Look at this," she whispered, moving her lamp closer. The beam struck a vein, and the numbers flared. 2024. 5. 14. Yesterday's date. She traced the line with her finger, not touching, following it to the next node. But there, between one date and the next, the opal went dark. A gap, a missing link in the chain. Theo was mapping the chamber with his notebook, sketching the layout in quick, practiced lines. "It's a calendar," he said, not quite a question. "The whole cave. It goes all the way around." Iris pulled out her grandfather's notebook, flipping to a page she'd passed over a dozen times. His handwriting, careful and small, opal date lines form ring, dark segments, doors, complete with steady light, node to open. Cost, colour, always finish the ring. She read it twice. Then she angled her lamp so the beam stretched between the two nodes, bridging the dark gap in the vein. For a moment nothing happened. Then the opal began to glow along the path of her light, pale and milky, filling in the missing segment. The cave made a sound like glass singing, very soft, and a membrane appeared in the air before her, thin as soap film, shimmering with the same opalescent light. "Iris!" Theo's voice held a warning. She stepped through before he could finish. The cave on the other side looked identical, but the air was different, warmer. She could smell cigarette smoke, faint, but recent. Her lamp showed the same glowworm ceiling, the same calendar ring, but when she checked her phone, no signal as expected. The date read May 13th, 2024. Yesterday. She was standing in yesterday. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She turned back to the membrane, still visible, still shimmering. Theo's face appeared on the other side, distorted, his mouth moving. She couldn't hear him. She reached through and felt his hand grab hers, solid and real, and let him pull her back into the present. The membrane closed like an iris, silent and complete. What just happened? Theo's grip on her wrist was tight enough to hurt. "I went to yesterday." Iris heard how it sounded. Impossible. But her shoes were wet with water that hadn't been in the present cave, and there was ash on her sleeve from smoke that didn't exist here. They climbed out into afternoon sunlight and Iris stopped. Something was wrong. The stop sign at the intersection was grey. Not faded red, but grey, the colour of old concrete. The roses in Mrs. Chen's garden, which had been blooming red that morning, were now a pale, washed-out grey. Everything red. Gone. Theo saw it too. His face went very still. "The opal you completed? What colour was it glowing?" Iris remembered. The dominant hue in that vein. The colour that had filled the gap when her lamplight struck it. Red. Deep, arterial red. "Oh," she said, very quietly. They went back to her house and spread Grandpa's notebook across the kitchen table. The entry was there, buried in margins and cross-references. Each completed vein takes the dominant hue from your return. Red first, then orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. To restore, trace the full ring, all 12 months every node, then snuff lamp at Heartpool when reflection shows complete circuit. Do not snuff elsewhere. Do not leave ring broken. "There's a pool?" Theo flipped through his sketches. "I didn't see a pool." "Centre of the cave," Iris said, reading ahead. "It mirrors the calendar. If you can see the whole ring reflected in the water, unbroken, you can reset. You snuff the lamp there, cut the flame completely, and the colours come back." Theo sat back. "Or we just don't go back. We let it stay. People live without red." But Iris was already thinking about traffic lights that no one could read properly. about blood that wouldn't look like blood, about her sketches. She lived in colour, needed it, saw the world through it. And the town wouldn't understand. How could they? They'd just wake up day by day as more hues vanished, never knowing why the sunset looked wrong or why their tomato plants seemed sickly despite being perfectly healthy. "I have to finish it," Iris said. "I started the circuit. I have to complete it." They returned to the cave at dawn. This time they brought more batteries, more rope, and a thermos of coffee that steamed in the cool underground air. Iris moved carefully around the calendar ring, testing short jumps. 3 days back, using a pale pink vein that cost her only a shade of rose. 2 days forward, through white gold opal that took almost nothing. She learned to read the spectrum of each vein before she completed it, to aim for cool blues and violets when she could, to avoid the warm, saturated hues that would rip more colour from the world. Each time she returned, something else had changed. The oranges at the market looked like pale yellow globes. The hazard tape around the sinkhole faded to a dull cream. Sunsets became gradients of grey and gold, beautiful in a different way but wrong, fundamentally wrong. On the 4th day, Mr. Vale arrived. He came with equipment, headlamps, core drills, sample bags. He'd been a foreman at the old quarry before it closed, Iris knew, and he had the kind of face that looked permanently dissatisfied, as if the world owed him something it had never delivered. He was standing at the cave entrance when she and Theo climbed down, and his smile was all teeth. "Heard about this place from the blasting crew," he said. "Opal deposit this size, even if it's thin vein stuff that's worth extracting. Filed a mineral lease yesterday." Iris felt cold. "You can't quarry here. Watch me." He clicked on his headlamp and pushed past them into the cave. The beam swept across the calendar ring and the dates flashed in sequence, bright and accusing. Vale didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He knelt by a thick vein and pulled out a rock hammer. "Wait!" Iris started forward, but the hammer was already swinging. It struck the opal with a sharp crack, and a chunk the size of a fist came away in Vale's hand. He turned it over, examining it under his light, and grunted with satisfaction. "Good colour," he muttered. "Mark it'll like this." Where the chunk had been, the calendar line went dark. A new gap, another broken link. And Iris understood with a sinking certainty that Vale couldn't see what he was doing. The missing reds, the absent oranges, he had partial colour blindness, the kind that made warm hues fade into each other. The calendar gaps looked like natural flaws to him, not wounds in a living system. "Stop," she said louder. "You don't understand. That's not just opal. It's money," Vale cut her off. "And it's on leaseland now. You kids want to look at glowworms, fine, but don't touch my product." He broke off 2 more pieces before Iris dragged Theo back toward the entrance. They couldn't stop him, not physically, and trying to explain would only make him dig faster. "We have to fix it," Iris said once they were back in sunlight. "Every gap he makes we have to complete, or the ring won't close." Theo looked at her with something like grief. "Every gap we complete takes another colour. You know that." She knew, but the alternative was worse. If the ring stayed broken, if she never snuffed the lamp at the heart pool, the colour loss would persist and spread. Grandpa's note suggested it would expand to adjacent hues, bleeding out until the world was monochrome, until everything was shades of grey and memory. They worked in shifts. Iris jumped carefully, using Vale's fresh gaps to travel months instead of days, because the calendar network allowed diagonal connections, rare white light veins that crossed the normal sequence. She went back to March to see if the sinkhole had been visible then. It hadn't. Forward to July to check if the cave stayed open. It did, though the entrance was reinforced with rebar. Each trip cost her something. A shade of blue here, a tone of green there. The sky began to pale. The river lost its depth of colour. At school, teachers complained about the lighting. The nurse's office put up new charts because the old ones looked wrong. Iris's art class became an exercise in frustration. She mixed paints that should have made purple and got grey. She couldn't see what was wrong, only that the world was draining hue by hue into flatness. Vale kept digging. He brought in a partner, a woman with a clipboard who talked about gem shows and international buyers. They set up lights in the cave, bright LEDs that made the glowworms retreat to the far corners. Under their glare, the calendar ring looked ordinary, just sparkly rock with a pretty pattern. Iris found the heart pool on the 9th day. She had to squeeze through a gap between 2 formations, following a cool draft that smelled of deep water. The pool was no larger than a dinner table, perfectly still, perfectly black. When she held her lamp over it, the surface showed her the calendar ring in reflection, every gap, every break, every dark segment that Vale's hammering had created. Grandpa's notes had been right. To reset, she needed a complete circuit. No gaps, no breaks. One continuous ring of light, and then the snuff, cutting the carbide lamp's flames so completely that not even a spark remained, doing it here, over this pool, with the full ring watching from its mirrored surface. "How many gaps are left?" Theo asked that night. They were sitting on Iris's porch, watching a sunset that looked like dirty dishwater. All the reds and oranges bled out. 14, Iris said. "Vale broke a whole pillar yesterday, collapsed an arc that covered November. I can trace it, but—" She didn't finish, but it would cost her. November's opal glowed in warm gold and amber. Completing it would take yellow from the world. School crosswalks would vanish into grey pavement. Daffodils would look like faded paper. Everything that relied on yellow for meaning or beauty would change, and no one would understand why. "Do it," Theo said quietly, "before he takes more." Iris waited until Vale left for the day. She climbed down into the cave, now lit by his harsh LEDs, and found the collapsed section. The opal was cracked but not destroyed. The date nodes were still intact. She turned off the floodlights. The breaker was labelled helpfully by Vale's electrician, and in the returning darkness, the glowworms emerged again, pale and patient. She completed the November arc in 3 continuous sweeps, standing on a limestone ledge with her lamp held steady, breathing carefully, knowing what it would cost. The opal drank her light and glowed, amber and gold and honey yellow, filling in Vale's destruction. When the circuit closed, she felt it more than saw it. A kind of resonance in the air, a rightness. She climbed out into a world where yellow was gone. The school buses were grey. The sun was a white hole in a pale sky. Her mother's daffodils, planted last fall and just now blooming, looked like tissue paper ghosts. That night, Iris couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with Grandpa's notebook open on her chest, reading his careful notes by phone light. He'd done this, she realised. He'd found the calendar cave long before the sinkhole reopened it, and he'd tested it, and he'd paid the price of learning. Some of his entries were written in noticeably different handwriting, compensation maybe, for colour loss affecting his perception of contrast. The last entry, dated 10 years ago, was brief. Ring complete. Colours restored. Sealed cave with blessing and dynamite. If it opens again, finish the circuit. The world needs its hues. He'd sealed it, and the flood had undone his work. Iris closed the notebook and made her decision. She needed 2 more days to map Vale's damage and plan her approach. He was getting bolder, using a small drill to extract whole segments of opal, leaving the calendar fractured in a dozen places. She avoided him as much as possible, waiting until evening when he left to meet his investor contacts. Then she and Theo would descend, and she would trace the gaps one by one, choosing her hues carefully when she could, sacrificing when she couldn't. Blue went next. The sky bled to grey. The river turned slate-coloured. Lake water looked like liquid metal. People walked around as if everything was normal, but Iris could see the confusion in their eyes. Colours weren't where they remembered them being. Stoplights showed only 2 distinct shades now, red and blue both gone. Accidents increased. The town council called emergency meetings that went nowhere, because how do you fix a problem you can't name? Vale noticed nothing. His colour blindness made him immune to the changes, and in a terrible way that gave him power. He could work steadily, systematically, while everyone else floundered in a world that was quietly going wrong. Iris lost green on a Monday. She'd had to complete a diagonal vein to connect March to September, bridging a gap Vale had created by pulverising a load-bearing node. The opal there ran in deep emerald and sage, and when she finished the trace, the whole cave rang like a bell. She returned to find grass the colour of old paper. Trees looked grey-brown, drained of life. The girl who sat next to her in biology burst into tears when she couldn't distinguish the plant specimens anymore, couldn't see the difference between healthy leaves and dying ones. "How many left?" Theo asked. His voice was flat. He was tired. They both were. 6 gaps, Iris said. Vale's meeting with his buyers tomorrow. He's going to bring them into the cave, show them the deposit. If they start real extraction... She didn't need to finish. Real extraction meant machinery, meant tearing out the calendar in chunks, meant gaps she couldn't possibly trace fast enough. The ring would shatter. Colour would never return. That night, she studied the heart pool's reflection in her phone photos. She could see where the remaining gaps were. 5 minor breaks and 1 massive fracture where Vale had destroyed a support column, collapsing the entire December arc. That one would cost her Violet, the last major hue, and she'd have to do it under pressure, with Vale and his buyers present, with time running out. Theo helped her plan it. He was good at systems, at seeing how pieces fit. "We kill his lights first," he said, drawing on a napkin. "Breakers outside the cave, easy access. That gives you darkness and brings back the glowworms. You'll need their light to see the dates properly." "Then I trace," Iris said, following his logic. "The minor gaps first, quick and clean. Save December for last." "And Vale?" Iris thought about the doors, about how they opened to specific dates, and how, if you stepped through without planning your return, without keeping your light source steady, you could end up sealed in a pass that didn't have an open sinkhole entrance. Trapped. "I'll manage Vale," she said. The buyers arrived at noon. There were 3 of them, dressed like they'd come from an office but trying to look rugged, carrying sample cases and wearing headlamps that probably cost more than Iris's entire art supply budget. Vale led them down into the cave with the pride of a king showing off his treasury. Iris and Theo were already inside, waiting in the shadows near the heart pool. The floodlights blazed. The buyers oohed and aired at the opal veins, taking photos, chipping off tiny samples with Vale's permission. They couldn't see the dates, Iris realised. To them it was just pretty rock with an interesting pattern. The calendar was invisible to people who didn't look for it, who didn't have the right light and the right intent. Theo slipped away toward the entrance. Iris counted to 100. Then the lights died. The darkness was absolute for exactly 3 seconds. Then the glowworms responded, brightening in the absence of competing light, and the cave filled with soft blue-green luminescence. The opal calendar caught their glow and reflected it, and suddenly the dates were visible, flashing in sequence around the chamber walls. The buyers froze. Vale cursed, fumbling for his backup light. Iris moved. She'd practiced the sequence in her mind 12 times. First gap, a tiny fracture in April, barely 3 inches long. She completed it with her lamp, a quick sweep that cost her only a shade. Of grey she barely had left anyway. Second gap, February, another small break. Third, fourth, fifth. She traced them in rapid sequence, feeling the ring tighten, feeling the circuit close node by node. The cave hummed. The opal sang. Vale finally got his light working. He swung it around and caught Iris in the beam, standing at the heart pool with her lamp raised. "What are you doing?" his voice echoed. "Finishing it," Iris said. "Finishing what? That's my opal. It's not opal." She was surprised by how steady her voice was. "It's a calendar. It's alive. And you've been killing it." Vale started toward her. The buyers clustered near the entrance, uncertain. Theo blocked their path, not aggressively, just standing there with his arms crossed and his face set. Iris turned to the December arc, the massive gap where Vale's pillar breaking had collapsed an entire month. The opal here was deep violet and indigo, the colours of late dusk, of distant mountains, of her grandfather's favourite ink. She knew what it would cost. Violet was the last hue she hadn't sacrificed. After this, the world would have only the faintest traces of colour left. Weak yellows that were almost white, shadows of green and blue, everything else drained to grayscale. "Don't," Vale said. He was close now, close enough that she could smell his sweat and his anger. "Whatever you think you're doing, it stops now." "You're right," Iris said. "It does stop." She completed the December arc in one continuous motion, her lamp beam steady, her hand unwavering. The violet opal blazed, filling in month by month, day by day, until the circuit closed with an audible snap. In the heart pool's reflection she saw it, the complete ring, glowing unbroken, every node connected, every date alive with light. Vale lunged for her. She had expected it. She stepped sideways onto a small date segment she'd marked earlier, December 31st, 1923, a full century ago, back when this cave was sealed and the outside entrance was buried under solid rock. She traced the vein with her lamp, completing the link, the membrane irised open. "Come see your investment," she said to Vale, and pushed him through. He stumbled into the past, into a version of the cave that was dark and untouched, and the membrane closed behind him before he could react. Iris heard his muffled shouts, saw his light moving on the other side of the opalescent film, but there was no sinkhole in 1923, no entrance, no exit. He'd be trapped until she opened the door again, and she had no intention of doing that until the reset was complete. The buyers ran. Theo let them go, then came to stand beside Iris at the heart pool. The reflected calendar ring glowed complete in the black water, every segment traced, every node connected, 1 full year, unbroken. "Now?" Theo asked. "Now," Iris said. She knelt by the pool, her grandfather's lamp heavy in her hands. It was an old-style carbide lamp, the kind that burned acetylene gas produced by mixing calcium carbide and water. To snuff it, you had to close the valve completely, cutting off the gas, and let the flame die without even a spark. It required a steady hand and perfect timing. Iris took a breath. The cave was very quiet. Even the glowworms seemed to be watching. She reached for the lamp's valve, a knurled knob, worn smooth by her grandfather's hand, and began to close it. The flame dimmed, shrank, became a tiny point of gold, barely larger than a candle. She closed the valve completely. The flame popped once and died. Darkness fell. Not the darkness of night, but something deeper, older, more complete. Iris couldn't see Theo beside her, couldn't see the pool, couldn't see her own hands. Then the water rippled. She heard it rather than saw it. A single wave spreading outward from the centre of the pool, lapping at the edges of the stone. And with that ripple came light. Not lamplight, not glowworms. Colour. It started as violet, blooming outward through the water like ink diffusing through still liquid. Violet spread to indigo, indigo to blue, blue to green. The progression was exact, was perfect, was the reversal of everything she'd sacrificed. Green to yellow, yellow to orange, orange to red. Each hue returned not gradually but instantly, snapping back into existence with an almost audible click, as if the world was remembering how to see. The opal calendar blazed with colour. The full spectrum, every shade she'd lost and more, richer than before, deeper. The dates flashed in sequence, a year's worth of time compressed into a single luminous ring. And then, one by one, the door membranes began to seal. They closed like pupils contracting, the opalescent films thickening into solid stone, the passages between dates locking shut. The calendar was complete but no longer accessible. It had served its purpose and now would rest. Iris struck a match. She'd brought matches just in case and relit her lamp. The flame caught and steadied. In its light she saw Theo staring at her with wide eyes, and beyond him the cave wall where the December segment had been dark. It glowed now, solid and unbroken, sealed with light. "The colours," Theo whispered. They climbed out into dawn. The sky was impossibly blue, the kind of blue that makes your chest ache. The roses in Mrs. Chen's garden blazed red, arterial and true. The school bus rumbling past was sunshine yellow. Traffic lights blinked in proper sequence, red, yellow, green, and Iris could see drivers relaxing, tension leaving their shoulders, normalcy restored. At the cave entrance she found Vale's equipment, his drill, his sample cases, his investor contracts. She left them where they were, let him retrieve them later when she decided to open the door and let him out. He'd been in there less than 12 hours subjectively. In the present, 3 days would pass before she returned. Long enough for his lease to expire, long enough for the town council to designate the area, protected land, prompted by an anonymous donation of Grandpa's field notes to the Historical Society. The notes arrived at the Society that afternoon, delivered by Theo's older sister, who asked no questions. They included sketches of the calendar ring, explanations of the opal patterns, and a personal letter from Grandpa describing the cave as a natural wonder requiring preservation and protection. The Historical Society brought in geologists. The geologists brought in archaeologists. By the end of the week, the sinkhole was fenced, the cave was gated, and Mr. Vale's mineral lease was voided on the grounds that the site had historical and scientific significance. Iris visited Vale on the 4th day. She descended into the cave, now lit by respectful LED strips that ran along the floor, casting light upwards so the glowworms weren't disturbed, and completed the 1923 door. Vale practically fell through, wild-eyed and dirty, his voice raw from shouting. She let him stumble past her toward the exit, didn't try to explain. Some people couldn't see colour even when it was right in front of them. The lamp went to the town museum, displayed in a case alongside Grandpa's notebook, and a large sketch Iris had made of the calendar ring. She'd wired the lamp's valve shut, a permanent safety measure. The placard beside it read, "Carbide Miner's Lamp, C, 1920, used in opal calendar cavern exploration. On loan from the estate of Thomas Blackwell, local historian and spelunker. No mention of time doors or colour theft, just a lamp and a story, and the truth preserved in the margins where only those who looked carefully would find it." Iris's last drawing, the one that took her 3 days to complete, showed the heart pool from above. The water was rendered in layered graphite and coloured pencil, each hue precise and true. The reflection of the calendar ring drawn in miniature so that if you looked closely, you could see every date, every node, every connection. It was her best work. She submitted it for the regional art competition and won, not because the technique was flawless, though it was quite good, but because the judges felt the piece had something essential to say about memory and restoration, about seeing what remained when things were taken away and fighting to bring them back. She hung the blue ribbon on her wall next to a photo of Grandpa taken before she was born, back when he was young and his hair was dark and he stood at a cave entrance with a carbide lamp in his hand and a smile that said he knew something wonderful and terrible and worth protecting. That summer, Iris took Theo back to the cave during a sanctioned tour. The guide pointed out the opal veins, explained the unusual formation patterns, mentioned the ongoing studies. The guide did not mention dates, did not talk about doors. The calendar ring was there, visible if you knew how to look, but to most visitors it was just pretty rock catching the light. At the heart pool, which the tour path now skirted, Iris paused. The water was still, black, perfect. She could see the calendar reflected in its depths, complete and whole, every colour present, every node connected. The ring glowed faintly even without lamplight, as if some of the colour she'd restored had soaked into the stone permanently, as if the cave remembered what she'd done and was grateful. Theo stood beside her, quiet. After a moment he said, "Do you ever want to go back? Try it again." Iris thought about it. Thought about doors opening to other times, about the cost of each journey, about how close she'd come to leaving the world grey and broken. She thought about her grandfather sealing the cave the first time, using dynamite and blessing, trying to protect people from their own curiosity and greed. "No," she said, "it's done. The circuit's complete." They walked out into afternoon light, into a world where colour meant what it should mean. Safety and warning and beauty and truth. The grass was green because spring was here. The sky was blue because air scattered light in specific ways. The sunset, when it came that evening, would be red and orange and gold because particles in the atmosphere bent and reflected the sun's rays at particular angles. Science and myth, Iris thought. Light and memory. The world was both at once, had always been both, required both to make sense. Her grandfather had known that, had found the calendar cave and learned its rules and paid its price and then sealed it away, not out of fear but out of love, because some things were too dangerous to leave accessible and too important to destroy. The gate closed behind them with a soft clang. Iris touched the lock, feeling the cool metal. Inside, the glowworms would brighten as evening came. The opal would glow, marking dates that meant nothing now that the doors were sealed. The heart pool would rest, its surface undisturbed, reflecting a year's worth of time compressed into stone and light. She'd finished the circuit, had traced every node, completed every gap, paid every cost. The colours had returned and the doors had closed and the world had moved on, never knowing how close it had come to losing something essential. That was fine. That was how it should be. Heroes in myths always worked in secret, always walked away when the task was done, always left the world a little better than they'd found it. Iris and Theo climbed the hill above the sinkhole and sat in the grass, watching the sun descend. The light shifted through the full spectrum, gold to amber to orange to red to violet, each hue clear and true and earned. Tomorrow she'd start a new sketch, maybe of glowworms against black stone. Maybe of the cave entrance framed by wild roses. Something with colour. Something that showed what remained when you looked carefully, when you paid attention, when you finished what you started. The lamp was safe in its case. The ring was complete. The calendar would keep time in its own way, patient and secret beneath the earth. And Iris, who'd walked between days and paid the price of restoration, would carry the memory of colours lost and found, would know in her bones what it meant to see the world truly, in all its necessary hues. That was enough. That was everything. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The bridge hummed even when Noah stood still. He'd crossed it 1,000 times, cutting through after violin lessons, headphones on, metronome ticking in his pocket, but tonight he heard it. A low drone, almost below hearing, rising from the iron latticework like something alive. Sodium lamps cast orange pools along the walkway. Between them, shadows turned the riveted trusses into cathedral ribs arching over the gorge. He stopped mid-span and pulled out his earbuds. The hum clarified. Not mechanical, not traffic. Wind threading through the 1890s ironwork, finding some resonant frequency in all that old geometry. His violin teacher would call it an aeolian tone. Wind-driven, self-sustaining. His phone said it was 110 Hz, maybe 115. Close to an A, but flat and restless. That's when he saw the fork. It was bolted to a gusset plate where two diagonal braces met, massive and industrial, easily 3 feet tall. Steel tuning fork, the kind you'd see in a physics textbook blown up to monument scale. Someone had engraved numbers along one tine, a worn scale half obscured by rust. Two heavy bolts with wing nuts protruded from the shaft, clearly meant to slide up and down to change the fork's mass distribution. Change the pitch. Noah touched it with one knuckle. It was cold, and it buzzed faintly under his fingertip, picking up the bridge's hum like a sympathetic string. He had a wrench in his backpack. He'd been tightening his violin's tailpiece before rehearsal. The temptation was stupid and immediate. Strike it. See what it sounds like. See if the engraved scale meant anything. He swung the wrench lightly against the left tine. The fork sang, a pure, high C-sharp, bright and cutting. The sodium lamps flickered. Not a brownout flicker, but something faster, strobing, like an old film projector catching. The river below jumped, ripples appearing 10 feet upstream of where they'd been. Stars smeared across the sky in short arcs. Noah staggered, grabbing the handrail as the world stuttered around him. Then it stopped. The fork still rang, its tone decaying slowly. The bridge looked the same iron, same lights, but the air felt different. Cleaner, maybe. He checked his phone. No signal. The date display blinked, confused, then settled. October 28th, 2024, last year. He stood there gripping the rail while his heart tried to catch up. The fork's ring faded to silence. The bridge hummed on, indifferent. A car passed behind him, an old sedan he didn't recognise, and he realised he was shaking. When the wind died, maybe 5 minutes later, maybe 10, the fork began to ring again on its own, softly, catching the bridge's fundamental and building on it. The world strobed. Noah held the rail and closed his eyes. When he opened them, the date on his phone read October 28th, 2025. Now. Home. He walked off the bridge on legs that didn't quite feel like his own. Halfway to Aunt Liv's apartment, he noticed the high-frequency hiss in his right ear. Tinnitus. And when he got home and started his usual late-night production session, the top end of his mix sounded muffled. Cymbals had lost their shimmer. Cricket sounds outside his window had gone silent. He didn't sleep. The next morning he told Sarah. They sat in the physics club room during free period, and he showed her the recording he'd made on his phone. 5 seconds of the fork's strike, the visual spectrum analyzer showing a clean spike at C-sharp, and underneath it the overlapping timestamp stuttering backward. She watched it 3 times without speaking. "You went back a year," she said finally, and came back when the fork rang on its own. And now I can't hear anything above maybe 14 kilohertz. Hearing loss? From one jump? I don't think it's damage. I think it's cost. Sarah pulled up a blank sheet in her notes app and started sketching. If pitch determines distance, higher pitch, shorter hop, then we need a map. That scale on the fork, those numbers, they have to correspond to years. They went to the bridge that afternoon. Noah brought his tuning app and a roll of masking tape. Sarah brought a laser measure and a frequency counter. They spent 2 hours documenting the fork, photographing the engraved scale, measuring the bolt positions, recording the bridge's ambient hum at different wind speeds. Sarah stuck strips of masking tape along the fork's shaft and wrote frequencies in Sharpie, building a ladder. Noah tested the sliding bolts. They moved grudgingly, corroded threads protesting, but they moved. "You're not jumping again," Sarah said. "I know. I'm serious. You've already lost high-frequency hearing. Next time it could be mid-range, voices, music." "I know." But he was already thinking about it. About tuning the fork to a specific year. About what you could fix if you knew the cost ahead of time. Aunt Liv had lost her car keys 3 weeks ago. She'd been running late for a night shift, torn the apartment apart, finally called a locksmith for $80 they didn't have. The keys had turned up 2 days later behind the microwave. If Noah could jump back 4 weeks, leave the keys on the counter before she looked, save her the stress and the money, would that be worth another slice of hearing? He told himself it was about helping. He told himself it was about understanding the rules. But really, he just wanted to know if he could tune a life the way he tuned a track, adjusting levels until everything sat perfectly in the mix. He went back alone. Higher pitch this time. He slid the bolts up the shaft, raising the fork's frequency to an F-sharp 2 octaves above middle C. The engraved scale suggested that would be a short hop. He struck it with the wrench, and the world strobed through 4 weeks in a cascade of sodium lamp flicker. October 1st, 2025. He walked to the apartment, used the spare key, found Liv's keys on the kitchen counter where she always left them, and moved them to the hook by the door. Then he walked back to the bridge and waited for the wind to die. The fork rang naturally. The world stuttered home, and Noah lost another band. The brightness of consonants, the crisp attack of snare drums, the way Sarah's voice used to hiss slightly on S sounds. It all blurred into a kind of soft-edged mush. He could still hear speech, still make out melodies, but the clarity was gone. Liv noticed the keys on the hook the next morning. She didn't say anything, just grabbed them and left for her shift. Noah sat in his room with his headphones on, trying to EQ back the frequencies he'd lost, knowing it was impossible. Sarah found out anyway. She saw him struggling in physics lab, not hearing the timer's beep, and she cornered him in the hallway afterward. "You jumped again. 4 weeks. Small one. And I can't hear your sibilants anymore." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were furious. "You're going to keep doing this, aren't you? You're going to tune yourself into silence. I'll stop." "When? When you can't hear me at all?" He didn't have an answer. She walked away. But 3 days later, she came back. "If you're going to be stupid," she said, "at least be scientific about it." She handed him a small device, a vibrotactile metronome, the kind used by deaf musicians. It strapped to his wrist and pulsed against his skin in rhythm. Bone conduction headphones are next. You're going to need to feel sound, not just hear it. They tested the bridge together after that, mapping its behaviour. The hum varied with wind speed and direction. Crosswinds from the northwest made it sing loudest, usually between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. when thermal shifts turned the gorge into a wind tunnel. The fork responded to the bridge's vibration, ringing sympathetically whenever the ambient tone matched its natural frequency. By adjusting the sliding bolts, you could tune the fork to match or mismatch that frequency. Match it, and the fork would sustain indefinitely as long as the wind blew. Mismatch it, and the fork would only ring when struck. Sarah rigged a sensor net, accelerometers taped to the fork's tines, a phone app that graphed vibration amplitude in real time. Noah could watch the peaks even when he couldn't hear the tone. It helped, but it also made him realise how much he was losing. Music wasn't just frequency data. It was colour and texture, the lived experience of sound. No graph could give that back. He jumped once more, a longer hop lowering the fork's pitch to an A-flat. The world strobed backward through decades. The bridge's LED lamps flickered into old incandescent bulbs. The asphalt approach turned to gravel. Rust accumulated and then vanished as fresh paint appeared. He landed in 1987. The bridge looked younger, sharper, its ironwork a deep municipal green instead of the oxidized brown he knew. He walked the span, touching the rails, feeling how solid everything was. No missing rivets, no patched welds. It hummed the same hum, but cleaner, somehow less burdened. Near the centre gusset plate, someone had left a notebook, the kind with graph paper and a hard cover. Noah flipped it open. Engineering diagrams, resonance calculations, spectrum analyses. A name on the inside cover, James Calder, Acoustical Survey, April 1987. Marginal notes in tight handwriting, fork installed June, natural Phrygian matches bridge fundamental at 112 Hz. Stable resonance confirmed. Recommend dampers if municipal noise complaints persist. Noah photographed every page. Then he waited on the rail until the fork rang itself home. The strobe carried him forward through years of weathering, past the millennium, into LED lights and cell towers. When he landed now, the tinnitus had spread. A roaring white noise filled the middle of his hearing range like static from a dead channel. Sarah's voice sounded underwater. Aunt Liv's too. He could still make out words, but only if he watched their lips. He told them he had an ear infection. Liv made him an appointment with an ENT. He cancelled it. That's when he met Calder. It was midnight. Noah had gone to the bridge to check the sensor readings. Sarah wanted data on how the fork's vibration changed with temperature. He expected to be alone, but someone was already there, a man in his 60s, grey hair pulled into a short ponytail, wearing a canvas jacket and work gloves. He had a toolbox open at his feet and was adjusting something on the fork's mounting plate. Noah's phone buzzed. The accelerometer app spiked. The fork was ringing, sustaining, holding a perfect tone, but there was no wind. The air in the gorge was completely still. "Don't touch it," the man said without turning round. His voice was rough, worn. "Let it sing." Noah stayed by the rail. The fork hummed on, impossibly sustained. The world didn't strobe. No time jump, just that endless ringing. The man, Calder, Noah was sure now, adjusted a small device clamped to the gusset plate, a mechanical shaker, the kind used to test vibration tolerance in engineering labs. It fed a controlled pulse into the structure, keeping the fork driven. "You're holding it," Noah said, "keeping it from decaying, keeping it perfect." Calder straightened and looked at him. His eyes were calm, even gentle. "You're the boy who's been jumping? I can tell. The way you hold your head, favouring one ear. How many bands have you lost?" 3. "And you'll lose more, unless you learn what I learned. If you never let the tone decay, the moment never ends." "That's not how it works. You have to let it ring naturally to come home." "Home to what? Entropy? Loss?" "I found the perfect night. April 15th, 1994. My wife, healthy. The bridge lights just replaced. Warm wind." We walked this span together and she laughed when the hum made her ribs vibrate. "I can keep that night forever if the fork never stops." Noah looked at the shaker, at the gloved hands, at the fork still singing its locked tone. "You can't hear it anymore, can you?" Calder smiled faintly. "Not for years. But I don't need to. I have the readouts. The accelerometers don't lie." "And everyone else in town? They're stuck too?" "They don't know. Time passes for them normally, within the locked year. Only the bridge remembers. You can't hold a moment forever. That's not living." "No," Calder agreed. "But it's not losing either." He packed his tools. "When you've spent enough years trying to tune your life, you'll understand. Perfection is a pitch you never release." He walked off the bridge, leaving the shaker running. Noah checked the app. The fork was sustaining at 112 Hz, the bridge's fundamental, locked in resonance. As long as that shaker ran, the fork would never complete a natural ring. No one could jump home. He called Sarah. She arrived 20 minutes later on her bike, helmet crooked, carrying a backpack full of sensors. They examined the setup. The shaker was bolted through the gusset plate, powered by a battery pack hidden in the truss hollow. Calder had also installed wind baffles, thin metal vanes positioned to catch any crosswind and deflect it away from the fork. Even if the shaker died, the wind couldn't ring the fork naturally, it was locked. "How long has this been running?" Sarah asked. Noah checked the battery. "Weeks, maybe. There are spares in his toolbox." "So everyone who jumped can't come back, not unless we break the lock." Sarah started taking measurements. Wind speed, ambient vibration, the precise frequency of the driven tone. She mapped the baffle positions with her laser measure and photographed the shaker's mounting. "We need to stop the drive and block any wind input, but we can't touch the fork. If we do, we'll add our own energy and it won't be a natural ring. How do we let it decay without touching it?" We don't let it. We create the conditions where it will. She pulled up a fluid dynamics app on her phone, started modelling wind flow around the bridge. The baffles are redirecting wind from the northwest. If we remove them and install temporary windbreaks on the upwind trusses, not touching the fork structure, just blocking the wind path, we can create a still pocket around it. Then we kill the shaker, set the fork to your home pitch, and let it find its own resonance in the ambient vibration. And if it doesn't, then we're guessing. But it's physics. Vibration couples through the structure. If the fork's tuned to the right frequency, and there's any ambient energy, it'll respond. They planned it for dawn. The wind died at sunrise. Thermal equilibrium, the gorge and the air the same temperature, no crossflow. They'd have maybe 10 minutes of dead calm, enough for one clean ring. Noah didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed feeling the vibrotactile metronome pulse against his wrist, watching the accelerometer app graph the bridge's continuous hum. The tinnitus roared in the frequencies he'd lost. He tried to remember what cymbals sounded like, what bird song sounded like, what Sarah's full voice sounded like. Memory wasn't enough. Audio wasn't just data. It was presence, dimension, the texture of the world. He'd traded it for control, and control had given him nothing but silence. At 5 a.m, Sarah texted, "Bridge in 30. They met under the sodium lamps. Sarah had tarps, bungee cords, and a cordless drill. Noah had his wrench and his phone. They worked quickly. The wind baffles came off first, 6 vanes, each one bolted to a truss bay. They stacked them on the walkway. Then they rigged windbreaks. Tarps stretched across the upwind trusses, positioned to block crossflow without touching the fork's gusset plate. Sarah checked every anchor point twice. The fork can't feel us working. Vibration isolation is critical. Noah found the shaker's battery pack and disconnected it. The fork's tone wavered, started to decay, then stopped, still humming, sustained by something else. He traced the vibration to a rattling street sign bolted to the handrail. Wind was pushing it, and it was feeding tiny pulses into the bridge structure, keeping the fork alive. "Grease the bolts," Sarah said, handing him a tube of lithium grease. Noah applied it to every rattling joint, every loose sign, every vibrating fixture within 10 yards of the fork. The ambient noise dropped. The fork's tone softened but still held, sustained by the bridge's fundamental hum. "Now we tune it," Sarah said. Noah pulled out his phone, opened the spectrum analyzer. He couldn't hear the fork anymore. His hearing loss had erased that frequency band, but he could see its peak on the graph. He needed to slide the mass bolts to match his home year pitch. The question was, what pitch was that? He tried to remember. The first jump, accidental, 1 year back. He'd had the bolts in a mid-range position, and the fork had rung at C-sharp. The 4-week jump had been F-sharp, bolts high. The long jump to 1987 had been a flat, bolts low. If pitch mapped to time distance, and his target was now, then he needed the fork's natural frequency, the pitch it would sing without any bolt adjustment. He checked Calder's notebook photos. Natural frequency, 112 Hz. Fork, fundamental, A, 110 Hz. Adjusted to A-flat for stability. Noah loosened the wing nuts and slid the bolts to their middle position, where the wear mark suggested they'd lived for decades. The spectrum analyzer showed the fork's peak shift downward, settling near 110 Hz, home pitch. The sky was lightening, pink clouds over the gorge. The wind had dropped to nothing. Sarah's ribbons hung limp from the trusses. Noah checked the accelerometer. The fork was still vibrating faintly, picking up the bridge's residual hum, but it wasn't ringing. Not yet. "We need a trigger," Sarah said. "Something to start it without touching it." Noah looked at the handrail. "I strike the rail. It conducts through the structure. The fork picks it up. Will that count as natural? It's ambient vibration. The fork finds its own pitch. Do it." Noah raised the wrench and struck the rail once, a clean hit that sent a shiver through the ironwork. The bridge hummed in response. The fork's tines began to vibrate, softly at first, then building, resonating with the 110 Hz fundamental that lived in the structure. The accelerometer spiked. The tone was growing. That's when Calder came running. He appeared from the far side of the bridge, moving faster than a man his age should, still wearing the canvas jacket, work gloves on. "Don't let it decay," he shouted. "You don't understand. If it rings out, I lose her, I lose that night." Sarah stepped into his path. He tried to go around her, but she moved with him, blocking. "It has to end," she said. "You can't hold a moment forever." "Why not? Why let time take everything? I found the equation, I built the tools, and you locked everyone else out. We can't go home because you won't let go." Calder stopped. His face was anguished, lined with years of choosing the same moment over and over. Noah could see it now. The man was a ghost, haunting his own perfect night, unable to live forward. The fork rang on, its tone pure and sustaining, decaying so slowly it felt like forever. "She wouldn't want this," Noah said quietly. "She'd want you to let her go." Calder's shoulders sagged. He stepped back from the fork, pulled off his gloves. "I can't hear it anymore," he whispered. "I haven't heard it in years. I just watched the numbers. Is it beautiful?" Noah checked his phone. The waveform was a perfect sine, decaying in smooth exponential curves. "I can't hear it either, but yeah, I think it is." They stood together in the dawn light, Noah, Sarah, Calder, and watched the fork's vibration decay on 3 separate screens. The accelerometer traced a downward slope. The spectrum analyzer showed the 110 Hz peak narrowing, fading. The tone held for 30 seconds, 40, a minute. The bridge hummed underneath it. The gorge filled with pink light. The fork sang softer, softer. Then it stopped. The world strobed. Sodium lamps flickered, though most had already switched off for daylight. The river ripples jumped. Stars, pale against the brightening sky, smeared and settled. Noah's phone blinked and showed October 29th, 2025. Now, home. The tinnitus didn't vanish. The lost frequencies didn't come back. Noah stood on the bridge in the early light, hearing the world through a narrowed band, and felt the vibrotactile metronome pulse against his wrist. He'd lost clarity. He'd lost brightness. But he could still hear the low hum of traffic starting on the distant highway. He could still feel the bridge vibrate under his feet. Hearing wasn't just ears, it was touch, sight. The way vibration moved through bone and made sense of the world. Sarah was watching him. "You okay?" He nodded. "Different, but okay." Calder was gone. They found a note tucked under the fork's mounting plate. Written on a torn piece of engineering paper, "Thank you for letting it end." No, signature. They never saw him again. Sarah filed a report with the city's Public Works Department, explaining that the bridge's tuning fork was a safety hazard, unstable resonance, potential structural issues. Within a month, they'd sent a crew. The fork came down. They installed detuners along the truss bays, damping vanes that broke up the wind-driven hum. The bridge still stood, still carried pedestrians over the gorge, but it no longer sang. Noah spent that winter learning new ways to listen. Bone conduction headphones let him feel bass frequencies through his jaw. Spectrum analyzers let him see the shape of sound. He composed a piece called One Free Ring, built entirely from recorded bridge hums, fork overtones, and the spectral data from that final decay. He couldn't hear all of it, not with his damaged ears, but he could see it on the screen, could feel it through the metronome on his wrist. Sarah said it was beautiful. Aunt Liv said it made her cry, though she couldn't explain why. On clear nights, Noah still walked to where the bridge used to hum. The iron was quieter now, muted by the detuners, but sometimes when the wind came from the northwest he could feel a faint vibration through the handrail. A ghost of the old resonance. He'd stand there with his phone out watching the spectrum analyzer for any trace of 110 Hz. It never appeared. The fork was gone. Its bolts and tines melted down or sold for scrap. But the bridge remembered. Structures always do. He'd lost something tuning his life, but he'd gained something too, a way of listening that didn't depend on perfect ears. Sarah taught him to read vibration the way he used to read sheet music. Aunt Liv learned some sign language, just in case. He adjusted. The last time Sarah mentioned it, they were sitting on the bridge at midnight, tarps and sensors packed away. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Noah thought about it, about the frequencies he'd never hear again, about Calder, trapped in his perfect moment, about the fork ringing its last natural tone, decaying into silence. "No," he said finally. "I learned to let go. That's worth more than perfect pitch." The bridge hummed softly beneath them. No strobe, no time slip. Just iron and wind and the long drop to the river. Noah felt the vibration through his hands on the rail, felt the metronome pulse against his wrist. He couldn't hear the hum anymore, but he knew it was there. That was enough. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. The gorge filled with the sound of moving water. Stars wheeled overhead, slow and constant, marking time the way they always had. The bridge held them, the way it held everyone who crossed, bearing the weight without complaint. Somewhere in the city, frequencies rose and fell, music, voices, the hum of transformers and traffic. Noah couldn't hear most of it, but he felt the world vibrate, and that was a kind of listening too. The fork was gone, but its lesson remained. Perfection isn't a pitch you hold forever. It's a ring you let decay, trusting that silence will bring something new. Noah stood up, helped Sarah pack the last of her equipment, and they walked off the bridge together into the ordinary night, leaving the iron to its quiet song. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.